In the gilded halls of British royalty, the portraits smile, the crowns gleam, and the myths speak of duty, dignity, and divine right. But behind the velvet curtains lies a very different monarchy, one built on cruelty, obsession, and secrets buried deeper than any royal tomb. These aren't bedtime stories. They're bloodlines soaked in scandal, madness, and the kind of silence that screams centuries later. You think you know the royals? Think again. This is 33 of the most disturbing British royal facts, and once you start, there's no turning back. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, especially if twisted history and royal darkness is your thing. It helps us keep uncovering what the textbooks politely avoid. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and tell us what time it is right now. Midnight? 3 a.m.? Perfect. You're exactly where you should be. 1 Edward II's grisly murder, 1327. Berkeley Castle sits quietly in the Gloucestershire countryside today, an ivy-draped monument to the past, visited by polite schoolchildren and history enthusiasts who like their monarchy sanitized. But in 1327, its stone walls bore witness to one of the most grotesque moments in royal history, an event so violent, so humiliating, that even the medieval chroniclers hesitated before putting quill to parchment. It's the kind of death that feels less like history and more like medieval performance art. And the victim? A deposed king, whose only crime was being born too early for the age of discretion. Edward II, son of the legendary Edward I, inherited the throne in 1307. Unfortunately, he also inherited none of his father's competence and all of his arrogance. He preferred the company of his male favorites over that of his court, his advisors, and especially his wife, Queen Isabella, known in later years, with a touch of medieval flair, as the she-wolf of France. You know you've alienated your kingdom when your wife teams up with her lover to invade England just to get rid of you. That's exactly what happened. In 1326, Isabella and her ally, Roger Mortimer, landed in England with an army and a grudge. Edward predictably fled. He was captured, imprisoned, and then formally deposed in January of 1327. His 14-year-old son was crowned Edward III, while the former king was quietly moved from castle to castle, a living embarrassment too dangerous to execute outright. But inconvenient royals don't tend to live long. By September, Edward was locked away in Berkeley Castle, guarded by men who had no interest in keeping him alive. There are reports of psychological torment, shrieking noises made outside his cell to unhinge him, rotten food, and deliberate cold. But psychological breakdown wasn't enough. Edward had to die. And more importantly, he had to die without leaving a single bruise. Because medieval politics wasn't just ruthless, it was deeply performative. You couldn't just murder a king and get away with it. There had to be no visible wound, no sign of foul play. Just a whisper, a rumor, a quiet end that smelled like plausible deniability. Enter the infamous method of death, the red-hot poker. Legend, yes, legend, because no one could ever officially confirm what happened, holds that the assassins inserted a red-hot iron rod into Edward's body via his most vulnerable opening. No blade, no bruises, just internal devastation. Supposedly, his agonized screams echoed through the castle's stone walls, so loud that villagers nearby could hear them. It's the kind of story you wish wasn't true. And maybe it isn't. Chroniclers of the time were already conflicted, some hinting at the tale with a wink and a shiver, others flatly refusing to repeat it. One writer merely said he was horribly put to death. Another offered the poker theory with the kind of veiled language that practically begs you to fill in the gaps. But here's the disturbing part. Whether or not the poker story is factual doesn't matter. The idea of it is the point. The myth became more powerful than any confession. A whisper of what the crown was willing to do. A warning masked as rumor. Because in medieval England, Nothing communicated authority quite like creative brutality wrapped in silence. Edward's death was never properly investigated. There was no trial, no inquiry, just a quietly buried corpse, and an even quieter note in the official record. His funeral was attended with proper royal ceremony, an extravagant contradiction for a man allegedly tortured to death in the shadows. Isabella and Mortimer ruled for 3 more years, their grip on power growing increasingly paranoid, until young Edward III came of age, executed Mortimer, and placed his mother under comfortable house arrest. And just like that, history tried to move on. The records became quiet again. Berkeley Castle returned to its domestic routines. But for centuries the echoes remained. The cruelty, the humiliation, the rumor wrapped in fire, it never really left. Because this wasn't just about killing a king. It was about redefining what power looked like. Not divine, not noble, but petty, fearful, and absolutely unapologetic. But if you think Edward's undignified end was an isolated incident in the royal annals, think again. The British monarchy, it turns out, has a curious habit of turning executions into pageantry, and sometimes into farce. Take, for example, the not-so-quick demise of Mary, Queen of Scots, who learned the hard way that in England, even death warrants came with a slapstick twist. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots' botched execution, 1587. By the time Mary Stuart finally stepped onto the execution scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587, she had already been many things. A queen at 6 days old, a widow at 18, a prisoner for 19 years, and a walking diplomatic crisis for virtually everyone in Europe. What she hadn't been, until that cold February morning, was a corpse. But even in that, the English authorities found a way to fumble the delivery. The story of Mary, Queen of Scots, is long, tangled, and embroidered with more plots than a Shakespearean anthology. But for now, all you need to know is this. She had a legitimate claim to the English throne. She was Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, and she had a knack for making people nervous. Especially her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. It didn't help that Mary had been accused, credibly or otherwise, of being complicit in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, or that her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell, looked suspiciously like the kind of man you marry when you're running out of monarchs to blame. After fleeing to England in 1568, Mary hoped Elizabeth would offer her protection. Instead, she got a very long stay in very uncomfortable castles. Under what could generously be described as protective custody, Mary was effectively kept as a political bargaining chip, a living threat, a symbolic alternative to the current regime. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth vacillated. She didn't want to execute a fellow queen. It looked bad on paper, and worse on a stained glass window. But by the mid-1580s, enough assassination plots had surfaced with Mary's name scribbled in the margins that Elizabeth's advisors were getting twitchy. The final straw was the Babington plot, an ill-fated Catholic conspiracy to murder Elizabeth and install Mary in her place. The letters implicating Mary were conveniently intercepted by Elizabeth's spy network, and suddenly the question wasn't if Mary would die. It was how quickly the paperwork could be filed. Which brings us to that fateful winter morning. Mary dressed for her death as if she were preparing for court. She wore a black satin gown, symbolic of martyrdom, with a velvet cloak and an underdress of crimson red, the Catholic color of martyrdom, defiance, and quite possibly brand management. She walked calmly to the scaffold, said her prayers, forgave her executioners, and offered her neck. It was supposed to be, if nothing else, a clean death. A formal, tidy severing of a once glorious threat. But then came the axe, and then came the second axe. It took not 1, not 2, but 3 swings to separate Mary's head from her body. The first strike missed the neck entirely and slammed into the back of her skull. a mistake that was probably felt more by the audience than by the victim. The second cut was closer to the mark, but still incomplete. It took a final, gruesome slice to finish the job. And then the executioner, in a moment of Shakespearean symbolism gone horribly wrong, lifted Mary's severed head by the hair and cried, "God save the Queen!" only for the head to slip from his grasp. Because Mary had been wearing a wig, her head dropped with a thud, leaving the executioner holding a clump of red hair and a sudden sense that maybe he hadn't quite nailed the moment. As if this grotesque parody of dignity wasn't enough, Mary's little dog was discovered hiding beneath her skirts, refusing to leave her remains. The animal reportedly had to be forcibly removed, refusing food and eventually dying from grief. Whether that part is true or just another embroidered detail from history's sentimentalists, it's hard to say. But the image has stuck. A small, loyal creature, surrounded by the pomp of state-sanctioned death and the accidental theater of human incompetence. Queen Elizabeth, for her part, claimed she never meant for the execution to proceed, at least not when it did. According to legend, she signed the death warrant, but left instructions that it shouldn't be delivered until further notice. When it was, accidentally or not, Elizabeth flew into a royal tantrum and exiled her secretary, blaming him for the whole debacle. But very few historians take her remorse at face value. It was politics, not tragedy. Because in this game, the death of a queen wasn't just an ending, it was a message. And Mary's death sent several to the Catholic powers of Europe that England would not be intimidated, to Elizabeth's subjects that no lineage, no title, no divine right could shield someone from the sharp end of loyalty, and perhaps to Elizabeth herself that absolute power comes with the exquisite discomfort of knowing where all the bodies are buried, because you put them there. Mary's botched death did what her life never quite managed. It unified her myth. She became a Catholic martyr, a tragic heroine, a cautionary tale depending on which window you looked through. But the English crown? It carried on, business as usual, with the blood still drying on the scaffold. And if you thought royal misfortune couldn't get any darker than an unclean beheading, wait until you meet the two little boys who vanished inside the tower, never to be seen again. And if you've made it this far, through royal silence and ruptured crowns, then you're definitely one of us. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We've got a lot more where this came from. And while the royals love to keep secrets, we don't. So tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Is it dark out? It should be. These stories hit different after midnight. 3. Richard III's Princes in the Tower, 1483. The Tower of London has long been a symbol of England's uneasy relationship with power, part fortress, part palace, and part holding pen for anyone who knew too much, claimed too much, or simply stood in the way. But in the summer of 1483, it became something else entirely. A black hole for two royal children whose disappearance remains, to this day, one of the monarchy's darkest and most persistent mysteries. The boys in question were Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9. Sons of King Edward IV, they were heirs to a powerful dynasty on the verge of collapse. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, young Edward automatically became king in name. But as with all child monarchs in chaotic times, the real question wasn't who held the crown, it was who held the child. Enter Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle, their protector. A seasoned military leader, loyal to his brother, and, allegedly, to the realm. For a while, things looked orderly. Young Edward was placed under Richard's guardianship, ostensibly to be prepared for coronation. He was taken to the Tower of London, standard practice for kings in waiting at the time, and was soon joined by his younger brother. From the outside, It looked like a period of royal grooming. But behind the stone walls, something shifted. Within weeks, the coronation was indefinitely postponed. Rumors began to swirl about the legitimacy of the boys, about secret documents declaring their parents' marriage invalid, about plots and counterplots only Richard could solve. Then came the real surprise. Richard declared himself the rightful king. Parliament passed a law, Titulus Regius, affirming the boys were illegitimate, and Richard III was crowned king that July. The princes were still in the tower, and then, suddenly, they weren't. There was no formal announcement, no funeral, no exile, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fade, it echoes. Observers noted that the boys had stopped appearing at the windows. Servants who once attended them were reassigned. Courtiers avoided the topic. Chroniclers became vague. And the tower? It held its breath. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. But few doubt that something did. Suspicion naturally turned to Richard III. After all, he stood to benefit the most from their disappearance. He had motive, access, and, as king, virtually unchecked power. But Richard never confessed, and no solid evidence directly ties him to the act. Some argued he wouldn't have risked the scandal. Others believed he ordered their deaths quietly, perhaps even reluctantly, in a moment of political panic. But others still suggested different culprits. Perhaps the Duke of Buckingham, perhaps even Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, who also had a vested interest in wiping the dynastic slate clean. And so the theories multiplied: smothering, poison, starvation, secret burials in the dead of night. All guesses, stitched together by inference and doubt. The only certainty? The princes were never seen alive again after the summer of 1483. In 1674, during renovations to the tower, workmen discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were two small skeletons. The bones were moved to Westminster Abbey, interred as the lost princes. But no official forensic investigation has ever been conducted. Permission to examine the remains has been requested and denied multiple times over the years. The monarchy, it seems, still prefers its mysteries unconfirmed. And Richard III? History wasn't kind to him. After just 2 years on the throne, he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field by the forces of Henry Tudor. His death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the rise of the Tudors. For centuries afterward, Richard was portrayed as a twisted villain, thanks in no small part to Shakespeare, who turned him into a hunchback tyrant with a dagger for a heart and a crown balanced on treachery. But modern historians have tried to soften the edges. Some argue he was a reformer, a victim of Tudor propaganda, a man whose actions were understandable, if not excusable, in a time where loyalty was measured in daggers and survival in swift decisions. Still, even the most generous reinterpretations struggle with the tower. Because in the end, the fate of the princes isn't just a historical question, it's a moral riddle. What does it say about power when 2 children can simply vanish, and the realm moves on as though nothing happened? No one protested, no public outcry, just a quiet understanding that sometimes history demands its sacrifices young. And while the tower has stood for centuries since, no stone has ever offered an answer. Only shadows, only silence. But if royal ambition could quietly erase 2 princes from the face of the earth, imagine what it could do in full view of the public, on a grand stage with cheering crowds, soaring hymns, and a sharpened blade. Because our next royal mystery isn't about vanishing, it's about spectacle. And it ends with a crown falling from a head. 4. Henry VIII's 6 wives, 2 beheaded. There's something morbidly efficient about the way we remember Henry VIII's marital history. It's been turned into a rhyme, after all. A cute little mnemonic device that children chant in classrooms across Britain. as if it were a nursery rhyme about animals or weather patterns. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. A tidy summary of 6 lives undone by one man's relentless need for a male heir and a clean conscience. Or at least the appearance of one. But underneath that jingle lies one of the most calculated campaigns of state-sponsored misogyny in royal history. And what makes it particularly disturbing is that it wasn't cloaked in secrecy. It was public, loud, and meticulously staged. When Henry VIII disposed of his wives, he didn't hide the mess. He turned it into theater. Let's start where things began to unravel. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first wife, married to him for over 2 decades. She was his brother's widow, a Spanish princess, and by all accounts, a competent queen. But she failed to produce a surviving male heir, and Henry, already restless, began to convince himself, and eventually the entire church, that this was divine punishment. The marriage, he declared, had never been legitimate. What followed wasn't just a divorce. It was an entire religious reformation, built brick by brick on the crumbling foundation of Henry's libido and ego. The Church of England was born, the Pope was out, and Catherine was sent into obscurity. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne was everything Catherine wasn't. Young, witty, ambitious, and importantly, fertile-seeming. Henry pursued her with obsessive determination even while still married. She played the game expertly, refusing to become his mistress, insisting instead on marriage. When she finally became queen, the pressure on her was astronomical. And when she, too, failed to deliver the much-desired son, giving birth instead to the future Queen Elizabeth I, her position became fragile. Whispers turned to accusations, treason, adultery, incest even. Anne's trial was a carefully constructed farce, featuring conveniently obtained confessions and suspiciously timed witnesses. Her death, however, was not rushed. Henry took care to import a French executioner, renowned for his skill with a sword, to give her a cleaner death. But the elegance of the blade didn't change the fact. She was executed in front of a crowd, a queen-turned spectacle. Henry wore white the next day and remarried within weeks. Then came Jane Seymour, who gave Henry what he wanted, a son, Edward. But she died soon after childbirth, and thus avoided the long descent into disgrace that seemed to await every woman who tied her fate to his. She was remembered fondly by Henry, though it's easy to look good when you die before disappointing him. Anne of Cleves followed, in what might be the most awkward blind date in royal history. Henry claimed he was misled by her portrait, painted by Hans Holbein, and upon meeting her in person, was allegedly appalled. Their marriage was annulled after just 6 months, but unlike her predecessors, Anne left with her head in a generous financial settlement. She was smart enough to play the role of beloved sister and never make a fuss again. But Henry wasn't done. Next was Catherine Howard. Young, barely out of adolescence, and perhaps too naive to realize that being queen consort to an aging and increasingly paranoid monarch wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a political minefield. Accused of unchastity before marriage and alleged indiscretions during it, she was arrested and executed at the Tower. Another queen, another scaffold, another state-sanctioned ending to a teenage girl's life, dressed up in ceremony. The final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived him. Barely. She was more nurse than spouse by the end, tending to a bloated and bitter king who had lost much of his former vigor. She navigated the role with caution, intellect, and luck, 3 qualities that, until then, had not guaranteed survival. And so, 6 women became footnotes in the biography of one man. But the tragedy isn't just that they suffered at Henry's hands. It's that the system allowed, encouraged, their suffering to be normalized, even aestheticized. Public trials, choreographed statements, politically convenient charges. All while the court clapped politely and the crowd craned their necks for a better view. There's something chilling about a monarchy that could weaponize marriage like this, turning love, loyalty, and lineage into a form of chess where the queen was always the most expendable piece. And the king? He was never wrong. Just unlucky, or so he claimed. But if Henry's romantic ruthlessness seems extreme, wait until you see what happens when royal marriage becomes not just a tool of control, but a literal act of war, complete with fire, blood, and forced diplomacy. Because our next royal episode isn't about divorcing a queen, it's about conquering one. 5. The Rough Wooing by Henry VIII. If the term rough wooing sounds like a contradiction, that's because it was. Romantic phrasing was stretched to its ironic breaking point in the 16th century Britain, where diplomacy often came wrapped in chainmail and delivered by siege cannon. The phrase was coined long after the fact, a dry, almost absurd label for what was, in essence, a brutal military campaign ordered by Henry VIII, all in the name of securing a marriage proposal, a forced courtship by sword, a royal engagement negotiated through arson. To understand how it happened, you need to appreciate Henry's deepest fear, not death, not even divine judgment, but lineage, specifically, his son's tenuous grip on the throne he had schemed and severed so many ties to secure. By the 1540s, Henry's only male heir, Edward VI, was still a child. A future king, yes, but also a fragile symbol. And symbols, Henry knew too well, required insurance policies, preferably the kind that came with treaties, dynastic bonds, and, ideally, marriage alliances. Scotland, meanwhile, had long been a thorn in England's side. The relationship between the two crowns was defined less by treaties and more by centuries of grudges and reciprocal invasions. But after the death of King James V of Scotland in 1542, leaving behind his 6-day-old daughter Mary, Queen of Scots, Henry saw an opening. Marry Edward to Mary, unite the crowns, cement his legacy, a peaceful, bloodless future. But peace requires two participants, and Scotland, though newly bereft of a monarch, was not interested. Scottish nobles, fiercely proud and pragmatically cautious, resisted the idea. They feared England's dominance, distrusted its intentions, and suspected, not without reason, that a Tudor alliance would mean Scottish sovereignty in name only. Henry, not known for handling rejection gracefully, responded in the only way he knew how, with overwhelming force. What followed was not a courtship. It was a series of invasions, raids, and scorched earth campaigns across the Scottish border. English forces, acting under Henry's command, and later that of his successor, Edward VI, razed towns, looted churches, and burned crops. Civilians, men, women, children, suffered disproportionately. Whole villages were reduced to ash, not because they resisted English troops, but because they represented a refusal to sign a marriage contract. This was wooing in the sense that a bear woos a beehive, loud, destructive, and with no intention of leaving anything untouched. One of the most notorious episodes came in 1544, when Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law and the Earl of Hertford, led a campaign into Scotland that culminated in the burning of Edinburgh. Not just a symbolic act, but a tactical one. The idea was to break the Scots into submission, force them to see reason. But the result was the opposite. Scottish resentment hardened. Any sympathy for an English alliance vanished in the smoke. And Mary, Queen of Scots, was quietly moved to France, betrothed to the Dauphin instead, further entrenching the Franco-Scottish alliance and humiliating Henry's efforts. So what did all this achieve? Strategically, very little. The marriage never happened. The war, if it can even be called that, devolved into a series of punitive expeditions that drained resources and credibility. But politically, It revealed something essential about the Tudor approach to diplomacy, that marriage could be wielded like a weapon, and that a crown, any crown, was worth burning another kingdom to the ground for. Henry died in 1547, just as the campaign was faltering. His son, Edward VI, inherited both the throne and the mess. The rough wooing continued under his regency, but without Henry's manic energy and iron will, it sputtered out. Scotland remained independent. Mary would grow up in the French court and eventually return to Scotland, not as an English bride, but as a Catholic queen in a Protestant kingdom. A different kind of problem altogether. In the end, the rough wooing didn't unite crowns. It didn't forge peace. It didn't protect dynasties. What it did was leave scars, burnt towns, orphaned children, and a legacy of mistrust that would linger for generations. And yet, the phrase has somehow endured, as if the entire campaign were just a failed romantic overture, a diplomatic misfire, a royal oops. But there's something telling in that euphemism. Because what is monarchy if not a long, elaborately costumed tradition of dressing up violence in language? Act of succession, dynastic claim, strategic union. All of it sounds civilized, until it doesn't. And if this is what royal marriage looked like on the battlefield, it begs the question, what did the home front look like? What kind of kingdom displays death like a warning sign, mounts heads on walls like family portraits, and turns punishment into public performance? The answer, as always, is England. And in the reign of young Edward VI, the architecture of power would become even more literal. Because nothing says authority like a city lined with corpses. 6. Edward VI's child corpses. Displayed Edward VI was 9 years old when he became King of England. Not old enough to ride a horse alone into battle, not old enough to vote in modern terms, and certainly not old enough to understand the machinery of power he was suddenly expected to represent. But he was a Tudor, and in Tudor England, kings didn't have to understand power to wield it. They just had to survive long enough for someone else to wield it in their name. Edward was the long-awaited son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, the male heir for whom heads had rolled and churches had been restructured. His birth was heralded as divine proof that the Reformation, the executions, the betrayals, and the divorces had all been worth it. A miracle wrapped in royal swaddling. But once Henry died, that miracle became a political pawn, guarded and controlled by ambitious men who saw in the child king not a ruler, but a vessel. And it's in this context, the rule of a child with no real agency, that one of the most disturbing features of his reign took hold: the public exhibition of death, especially of those deemed traitors. The bodies of the condemned weren't just disposed of. They were paraded, dismembered, and used as civic decoration. A policy carried out not in secret, but in the full light of day, with deliberate spectacle. It wasn't a new practice, of course, but under Edward VI, it took on a chillingly systematic character. Political enemies, real, suspected, or simply inconvenient, were not only executed, but put on display for weeks, sometimes months, across bridges and gates throughout London. Severed heads became part of the city's visual vocabulary. You could hardly walk across London Bridge without passing under the blackened remains of someone who had fallen out of favor. And Edward, young as he was no passive observer. He was educated, precocious, and steeped in Protestant theology. His journals, written in a stiff, childlike hand, occasionally record executions with the casual air of noting a chess move. To be clear, he wasn't cruel in the way of tyrants. He was clinical, detached, as if death were just another policy tool. Or worse, a kind of math problem. If you remove enough heads, the kingdom stabilizes. One of the more emblematic cases of Edward's reign was that of Thomas Seymour, his own uncle. Thomas had made the strategic error of underestimating how carefully watched Edward was. Ambitious, manipulative, and dangerously charismatic, Seymour sought to gain influence over the boy king by attempting to kidnap him. When caught, he was tried and executed in 1549. His punishment, like so many others, didn't end with death. His head was placed on a spike, literally above the city, as a lesson to anyone who might confuse family ties with immunity. But even that wasn't the darkest symbol of the regime's approach. In 1550, when a rebellion broke out in Norfolk led by Robert Kett, fueled by anger over land, enclosures, and economic injustice, the state's response was swift and deliberately theatrical. After the revolt was crushed, over 300 rebels were executed. Some were hanged from church steeples. Others were left dangling from trees. And for those who were deemed ringleaders, parts of their bodies were displayed in towns across the country. Executions weren't just punishment, they were policy announcements. National press releases written in flesh. Now, let's pause. It's easy to think this is just what the 1500s were like. Brutal times, brutal measures. But that's a historical dodge. Because not all kingdoms leaned so heavily on public death. Not all rulers made such a conscious effort to turn the visibility of violence into a tool of governance. Under Edward VI's regime, controlled by a regency council led by his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, terror was infrastructural. It was routine. What makes it more disturbing is how normalized it became. For Londoners, seeing a child king on the throne and corpses on display wasn't a contradiction. It was a coexistence they were trained to accept. A nation ruled by a boy and managed by the gallows. But what about Edward himself? Was he aware of the weight of his decisions? Possibly. His writings suggest a strong sense of duty, righteousness, and a belief in divine order. In his mind, rebellion wasn't just a political issue, it was a spiritual one. Disloyalty to the crown was disloyalty to God. And if the punishment seemed extreme, it only proved how seriously the system took sin. Edward died young, at age 15, leaving behind a kingdom on the verge of religious chaos and a legacy that history struggles to reconcile. On one hand, a boy who reigned in earnest, pushing forward Protestant reform. On the other, a child whose reign left an unusually high number of heads decorating the city gates. It's a strange juxtaposition, the purity of youth and the pageantry of death. But in Tudor England, appearances were everything. And the sight of rotting heads on pikes wasn't just tolerated, it was curated. A gruesome mosaic, telling citizens every day who had lost the Game of Thrones. Still, for all the crown's attempts to make death a warning, it had a funny way of inspiring the opposite. Because just a few years later, England would be swept up in a religious backlash so intense, so fiery, that it earned its orchestrator a nickname soaked in terror. A woman whose reign would turn execution from spectacle into ritual. 7 Bloody Marys burnings, 1553 to 1558. If history remembers Edward VI as the boy who ruled with a chilling sense of detachment, then his half-sister Mary Tudor is remembered as the queen who ruled with fire. Literally, in the case of the roughly 300 people she had burned at the stake during her 5-year reign. It earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, a title still whispered with a mix of horror, folklore, and the sort of morbid intrigue that eventually turned her into a cocktail. But beneath the label lies a reign that wasn't just violent. It was deeply personal, tragically desperate, and morally combustible. Mary's path to the throne was anything but smooth. She was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, the very marriage Henry tore apart England to escape. Declared illegitimate after her parents' annulment, Mary spent her youth watching from the sidelines as her father cycled through wives. Her religion was outlawed, and her very identity was rewritten to fit the royal script. She survived only by playing the long game, submissive when necessary, stubborn when permitted, and always Catholic, even when it was politically dangerous to be so. When Edward VI died in 1553, Protestant nobles tried to block Mary from taking the throne by naming Lady Jane Grey, a teenage Protestant, as queen. That effort lasted 9 days. Mary rallied supporters, marched into London with the force of legitimacy behind her, and claimed the crown she had been denied for decades. For a brief moment, it seemed like a triumph of justice. But Mary didn't come to power simply to rule. She came to undo, to roll back the Protestant reforms of her father and brother, to restore the Catholic Church, and most crucially, to secure an heir who would preserve it all after she was gone. This wasn't politics for her, it was penance. And so, within months of ascending the throne, Mary began reshaping England, not just in law, but in conscience. Protestant clergy were removed. Catholic Mass was restored. And then came the trials. The heresy laws, abolished under Edward, were reintroduced in 1554. The effect was immediate. Anyone preaching Protestant doctrine, possessing banned books, or even publicly questioning church orthodoxy could be arrested, tried, and executed. And in these trials, the standard of mercy wasn't leniency. It was recantation. The condemned were offered a choice: renounce their beliefs or face death. Some recanted and lived. Others didn't. The burnings began in earnest that same year. But this wasn't a purge conducted in darkness. These were public events, carried out in marketplaces, town squares, and fields. They were community gatherings, announced in advance, sometimes even scheduled to follow church services. Entire families would attend. Food stalls would spring up, and parishioners would pray while the state enforced its version of salvation. The logic was theological, as much as it was theatrical. Fire was seen not just as punishment, but as purification. A sinner consumed in flames might, it was believed, find redemption through suffering. Of course, this conveniently ignored the suffering of the onlookers, the townspeople who watched their neighbors become living warnings. Children witnessing their parents die for reading the wrong scripture. Communities torn apart by whispers and accusations. Among the most well-known victims were Bishops Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, and Thomas Cranmer, all high-profile figures in the Protestant Reformation. Their executions were carefully staged, meant to send a message to both the elite and the commoner. Latimer, as legend has it, addressed Ridley with defiant final words. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." It's a moment of drama fit for a novel, but it also highlights the strange inversion of power. In trying to extinguish Protestantism, Mary created its martyrs. And that's the great irony of her reign. The more she tried to impose unity through fear, the more entrenched the resistance became. Her actions didn't just fail to reverse the Reformation, they solidified it. Protestant identity, once a theological position, became a matter of survival, resistance, and eventually national character. Mary's personal life mirrored the disappointment of her political ambitions. Her much-publicized marriage to Philip II of Spain, meant to secure an heir and forge a Catholic alliance, proved unpopular at home and fruitless in the nursery. She believed herself pregnant twice. Most historians now agree these were likely phantom pregnancies. The heir she dreamed of never came. The Catholic England she envisioned never materialized. By the time she died in 1558 at age 42, Mary was isolated, exhausted, and widely unpopular. Her successor, Elizabeth I, her Protestant half-sister, would carefully reverse nearly every religious policy Mary had put in place. And with that, the burnings stopped. But the memory didn't. Bloody Mary was born not just of violence, but of failure. Her legacy became shorthand for religious intolerance, for misplaced zeal, and for a monarch whose attempts to save the soul of a nation ended up branding her as one of its darkest figures. It's easy to condemn her now, easier still to reduce her to the infamous nickname. But in reality, Mary was a woman raised in trauma, shaped by rejection, and consumed by a sense of divine duty too heavy for any crown. Still, if Mary's fire was about belief, then the next monarch's darkness came from a very different place. Less about faith and more about fear. Because when James VI of Scotland took the stage, his enemies weren't just political. They were supernatural. And in his mind, they were everywhere. 8. James VI and witch hunts, Scotland, late 1500s. Before James VI became the first monarch to unite the crowns of England and Scotland in 1603, he was already ruling Scotland with a strange blend of scholarly ambition and existential terror. He was known as a king who fancied himself intellectual, fluent in theology, fond of debate, and obsessed with the metaphysical. He wrote books, he argued doctrine, he believed deeply in divine right, and yet, for all his learning, he spent a significant part of his reign terrified of witches. Not metaphorical witches, not political enemies dressed in the language of superstition, actual witches, women, and occasionally men, whom he believed were conspiring with the devil to kill him personally. This wasn't an idle fear, it was an obsession. And unlike most royal paranoias, James had a moment he pointed to as the beginning of it all, a storm. In 1589, James was returning to Scotland from Denmark with his new bride, Anne of Denmark. Their crossing was troubled by violent storms that nearly wrecked the fleet. Initially chalked up to unfortunate weather, the voyage took a darker turn when Danish authorities, always eager to export their religious anxieties, accused witches of conjuring the storm. The accusation was theatrical, convenient, and absurd. James, however, believed it completely. Once back in Scotland, the king was no longer content to leave witchcraft in the realm of folklore. He brought it into the courtroom. He made it a matter of state. What had once been rural superstition became national policy, and what followed was one of the most aggressive witch hunts in British history. The North Berwick witch trials of 1590 to 1592 were among the first major episodes of this hysteria. Over 70 people were implicated. Many were tortured into confession, some even naming each other under pressure. They were accused of raising storms, cursing livestock, poisoning wells, and even flying to secret nighttime gatherings to plot the king's demise. It was grim, chaotic, and almost entirely unverifiable. But that didn't matter, because James wasn't simply convinced. He was personally involved. He attended interrogations. He supervised investigations. He reportedly even questioned some of the accused himself. His presence didn't lend sobriety to the proceedings. It gave them an official glow. If the king believed witches were real, then who were his subjects to argue? James also wrote a book, Demonology, published in 1597. It wasn't just a theoretical treatise. It was a practical guide on how to identify, interrogate, and eliminate witches. He warned of their cunning, their deception, their ability to masquerade as normal, pious citizens. He urged readers to be vigilant. He encouraged suspicion. And he handed judges and clergy a playbook that would define Scottish witch trials for years to come. The effect was immediate and devastating. Witch accusations spiked. Communities turned on one another. Women, especially older or socially marginal ones, were particularly vulnerable. It took very little to be accused. A quarrel with a neighbor, a miscarriage nearby, a cow falling ill, or even just muttering to oneself in public. Once accused, the burden of proof was on the victim. And the standard of proof? That depended on the creativity of the interrogator. Trials were harsh, outcomes were brutal, and the fear was self-sustaining. Because every confession bred new accusations. Every witch burned or imprisoned was seen not as an error, but as a necessary sacrifice to maintain order. And all of it was done with the implicit, and sometimes explicit, blessing of the crown. Eventually, James's obsession with witchcraft began to mellow. By the time he ascended to the English throne in 1603, his priorities shifted. Politics required new alliances, new concerns. He never entirely abandoned his belief in witches, but he no longer led the charge. His later years saw him distancing himself from the kind of hysteria he once championed. The witch trials slowed, though they did not stop entirely. The damage, however, was already done. The real horror of James's witch hunts isn't just the number of lives destroyed. It's the fact that they were fueled not by fringe zealots or mobs, but by the king himself. A ruler who believed his personal fears were national threats. A monarch who weaponized superstition with legal authority. Who read scripture, wrote essays, and then sent women to their deaths for the crime of existing in his nightmares. And in that sense, James VI wasn't just afraid of witches. He was afraid of the invisible, the unknowable. The idea that there were forces in the world he couldn't control or understand. In his mind, the devil wasn't a metaphor. It was an active force. And like any good bureaucrat, he tried to root it out with paperwork, torture, and fire. But if James feared what lurked in the dark, his successor would make darkness an institution. Because under Elizabeth I, fear wasn't just something to fight. It became policy. And her preferred tools? Torture chambers, secret prisons, and whispered confessions, etched not in fire but in silence. 9. Elizabeth I's torture chambers. Elizabeth I is remembered as the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the patron of the English Renaissance. Her reign brought stability, maritime expansion, and theatrical pageantry, golden gowns, poetic speeches, and naval triumphs like the defeat of the Spanish Armada. But beneath the myth of benevolent majesty was a reality shaped not by peace, but by paranoia. For all the glory, Elizabeth's England was a place of fear. Not always on the surface, of course. On the surface, things sparkled. But underneath, in the shadows and the back rooms and the stone-walled corridors of England's oldest castles, state terror operated like clockwork. Because Elizabeth, for all her brilliance, governed with one eye fixed on the knife. She was a woman on a throne not built for women, ruling a country split by religion and still scarred by the chaos of her predecessors. Every day, her legitimacy was questioned, by Catholics who saw her as a usurper, by foreign powers who saw her as an obstacle, and by political opportunists who saw her as a very vulnerable symbol. And in that context, security wasn't just a concern, it was a full-time religion. Enter Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham wasn't a soldier, or a poet, or a courtier. He was Elizabeth's spy master, her personal agent of stability. A man whose methods were quiet, calculated, and absolutely without sentiment. He built one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in Europe, intercepting letters, turning double agents, and organizing elaborate sting operations to uncover Catholic plots against the Queen. He is often credited with uncovering the infamous Babington plot in 1586, which ultimately led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. But that was only the most public success. Behind the scenes, Walsingham's fingerprints were on everything, from whisper campaigns to coerced confessions to the silent orchestration of disappearances. Treason in Elizabethan England was more than a legal charge. It was a performance, a lesson, a warning. And nowhere was that clearer than in the hidden prisons beneath the Tower of London and in places like the Gatehouse at Westminster or the old cells at the Guildhall. These were not places of due process. They were pressure cookers designed to break people without necessarily breaking the law. Inside these chambers, prisoners were encouraged to confess. This encouragement took many forms. prolonged isolation, relentless questioning, and, when necessary, physical coercion. Devices like the rack, the manacles, and the scavenger's daughter, a compression device designed to contort the body inward, were all used during this period, not as instruments of punishment, but as tools of information gathering. Or, in modern language, enhanced interrogation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't done in a fit of rage. It was systematic, approved, codified. Queen Elizabeth herself signed off on torture in select cases, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes not. One of the more notorious examples is the case of Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest captured in 1581. He was imprisoned in the Tower, questioned repeatedly, and subjected to excruciating methods. Eventually, he was forced to confess to treason, though what he had really done was return to England to minister to its underground Catholic population. He was tried, executed, and held up as proof of the regime's control. But it wasn't only clergy. Anyone suspected of harboring fugitives, printing forbidden texts, or simply knowing the wrong people could find themselves in custody. Even silence was dangerous. If you refused to speak, refused to confess, to name names, to validate the fears of the regime, you were seen as guilty by omission, and often treated accordingly. What's especially chilling is how carefully Elizabeth's government managed appearances. Officially, England was a lawful state, a realm of courts and judges and legal procedure. But behind the ceremony, state agents operated in a murky in-between, where evidence could be manufactured, confessions extracted, and threats neutralized before the public ever heard a whisper. This wasn't medieval chaos. It was modern in its efficiency. Bureaucracy with teeth. Yet Elizabeth herself remains a puzzle. Was she personally cruel? Most historians say no. She disliked executions and often delayed them. She wept after signing Mary Stuart's death warrant. But she was also a survivor. And like all survivors of dynastic bloodlines, she understood that mercy was a currency you spent carefully, and only when it wouldn't come back to slit your throat. So she delegated. She allowed Walsingham and others to manage the darker business of rule. And she kept her hands clean, at least in public. The Virgin Queen could parade through London in gold brocade, while in the Tower, a man named John Gerard was being dangled by his wrists in manacles, or a woman named Anne Bellamy was watching her family's house collapse under the weight of suspicion. It's hard to say how many people were imprisoned, interrogated, or executed under Elizabeth's reign. Records are incomplete. Some cases were never written down. Some were quietly erased. But the message was unmistakable. Dissent was dangerous. Secrecy was suspicion, and silence could be fatal. The golden age of Elizabethan England, it turns out, had a distinctly iron underside. And yet, for all the subtlety of her methods, Elizabeth's rule would give way to something much louder, much bloodier, and far more public. Because when her cousin's son, Charles I, took the throne, royal punishment left the dungeon and climbed the scaffold. Not a whisper, not a rumor, but a crown, and then suddenly a severed monarchy. 10 Charles I executed in public, 1649. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, the streets of London were eerily silent. Not empty, no, quite the opposite. They were packed, shoulder to shoulder, with onlookers who had come to witness the unthinkable. But there was no cheering, no revelry, just the brittle stillness of a country holding its breath. Because for the first time in English history, a reigning monarch was about to be executed by his own people, under his own sky, outside his own palace. Charles I had reigned for 24 years, and in that time, he had managed to alienate almost everyone who mattered. Parliament, the army, the nobility, the Scots, the Puritans, the Catholics. Pick a group, and chances are Charles had offended them in some way. He wasn't a monster, not exactly. But he was stubborn in the way only kings can be, certain that God had chosen him, and equally certain that anyone who questioned him was questioning the divine order. His fatal mistake was assuming that divine order would always come with a safety net. The political crisis that consumed his reign began, as so many do, with money. Charles wanted to rule without parliament, but he still needed funds, especially for wars. So he resorted to forced loans, arbitrary taxes, and all manner of financial gymnastics. Parliament, predictably, was not amused. But the real fracture came with religion. Charles married a Catholic queen, supported controversial clergy, and introduced reforms that smelled suspiciously like Rome. To the growing number of English Puritans, this wasn't just poor taste. It was betrayal. By the 1640s, tensions exploded into outright war, civil war. On one side, the Royalists, or Cavaliers, loyal to the king. On the other, the Parliamentarians, or Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell and backed by a rising tide of puritanical military discipline. The conflict was bitter, confusing, and devastating. Families were split, cities were besieged. The idea of England itself seemed to fray. Charles lost, twice in fact. He was captured, escaped, recaptured, and then, after years of maneuvering, put on trial. Not a symbolic trial, a real one, with judges, witnesses, and all the pageantry of legal order. Except this was no ordinary court. It was a revolutionary tribunal, convened not by law but by will. Parliament had purged itself of royal sympathizers and created what became known as the Rump Parliament, determined to do what had never been done, hold a king accountable to the people. Charles, for his part, refused to recognize the court's authority. He didn't defend himself because he didn't believe there was anything to defend. A king, in his mind, answered only to God, not to soldiers, not to lawyers, not to the masses gathered outside. So he stood, silent and scornful, as the charges were read aloud: tyranny, betrayal, and the shedding of English blood. The verdict was never in doubt. He was sentenced to death by beheading. And so, on that frigid morning in January, Charles dressed with care. He wore 2 shirts to keep from shivering on the scaffold, lest the crowd mistake his trembling for fear. He stepped outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, where a platform had been erected, stage-like, before an audience of thousands. Soldiers lined the path. Drums beat steadily. The air hung heavy with something between awe and dread. He spoke briefly, calmly. He reaffirmed his innocence, his belief in monarchy, his trust in God. And then, with a quiet dignity that surprised even his critics, he knelt. The execution itself was quick, delivered by an anonymous masked man whose name was never officially recorded. The identity of the executioner remains a matter of historical speculation. No one wanted to be remembered as the man who killed a king. What we do know is that when it was done, a groan rippled through the crowd. Not cheers, not applause. Just a kind of low animal sound, half disbelief, half mourning. Because something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just the death of Charles Stuart. It was the temporary death of monarchy. The execution sent shockwaves across Europe. Kings and queens in neighboring countries were horrified, not by Charles's actions, but by his fate. If an English monarch could be tried and killed like a common criminal, what did that mean for the rest of them? What did that mean for the idea of monarchy itself? Of course, the English monarchy wouldn't stay dead for long. Within 11 years, the crown would be restored, and Charles's son would be invited back to the throne with open arms. But in 1649, all that was uncertain. What came next wasn't peace, but a vacuum, filled by a regime that promised order and godliness and delivered something far more complicated. Because when you kill a king, you don't just change the ruler, you change the rules. And when the monarchy returned, it returned with a grudge, a long memory, and a sharpened sense of revenge. And that's exactly what happened next. Because even after death, Charles had enemies, and his son, Charles II, knew how to settle a score, even if he had to dig up a few old corpses to do it. 11. Oliver Cromwell's posthumous revenge, 1661. There are few insults more thoroughly English than disinterring your political enemy, hanging his corpse in public, and beheading what's left, years after he died. It sounds like satire. It sounds like medieval absurdity. But in 1661, that's exactly what happened to Oliver Cromwell. The man who had once ruled Britain without a crown was now a cadaver in a wooden box, buried quietly beneath Westminster Abbey. But even that wasn't safe, because when the monarchy returned after the English Civil War, so did the need for vengeance. The kind of vengeance that doesn't rest, even if the target already has. To understand how a body becomes a symbol, you have to go back a bit. Oliver Cromwell was never a king, but for a time, he was more powerful than one. A former member of Parliament, military commander, and Puritan radical, Cromwell rose through the chaos of the English Civil War as the leader of the parliamentary forces that ultimately defeated Charles I. Where others hesitated, Cromwell acted. He didn't just fight the king, he executed him. Or, more precisely, he signed the death warrant and made sure the axe fell. Then he abolished the monarchy entirely and turned England into a republic. The Commonwealth was its name, but the reality was a military dictatorship. After a few years of ineffective civilian governance, Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector in 1653, a title that had all the weight of monarchy and none of the glitter. He ruled for 5 years, using his power to enforce Protestant morality, suppress uprisings, and wage war across Ireland and Scotland. Some saw him as a religious visionary. Others saw him as a military tyrant draped in scripture. When Cromwell died in 1658, his body was given a royal-level funeral. Ceremonial procession, burial in Westminster Abbey, and all the honors typically reserved for kings. The monarchy, it seemed, was gone for good, but the vacuum left behind after his death proved too unstable. His son Richard briefly inherited the title of Lord Protector, but had none of the political will or military support to hold it. The experiment collapsed. By 1660, the exiled Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, was invited back to England to restore the monarchy. And if Cromwell had feared divine judgment in the afterlife, he may not have imagined the human version would come first. Charles II returned not only with a crown, but with a long memory and a short temper. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make sure everyone who had touched his father's execution paid dearly, dead or alive. Many of the surviving regicides, those who had signed the death warrant, were captured, tried, and executed in spectacular fashion. But for Cromwell and a few of his closest allies, death had come too early. So Charles did something unprecedented. He ordered that the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, his son-in-law, and John Bradshaw, the judge, who presided over Charles I's trial, be exhumed from Westminster Abbey. Their remains were dragged out of their graves on the anniversary of the king's execution, as if to make the symbolism as explicit as possible. They were taken to Tyburn, the traditional execution site in London. There, the bodies were hanged, ritually, since they were no longer alive, then beheaded. Their heads were mounted on spikes and placed atop Westminster Hall, where Charles I's trial had taken place over a decade earlier. A kind of poetic geometry, a closing of the circle. Cromwell's head stayed up there for years. Eventually, it fell, literally, blown down by the wind. What followed is a strange side chapter in British history. The head went missing, passed through private collections, was exhibited at fairs, and reportedly ended up in the possession of a Cambridge college. It wasn't formally buried again until the 20th century, more than 300 years after Cromwell died. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about symbolic erasure. By exhuming and desecrating Cromwell's body, Charles II wasn't just punishing the man, He was rewriting the narrative, making a statement that regicide wasn't just wrong, it was cosmically wrong. The monarchy wasn't merely restored, it was avenged. And in true royal fashion, it was done in full view of the public, with ceremonial precision and a flair for moral theater. And yet, the irony persists. Because while Cromwell's body was destroyed, his legacy lingered. The idea that a monarch could be held accountable, that divine right could be overruled by earthly law, never quite vanished. His ghost haunted the crown for centuries. Even as his head rolled through history like a relic, no one knew quite what to do with. But Charles II wasn't finished. Digging up enemies was one thing. Making examples of living ones was even more effective. And for that, he turned to the old scripts, the medieval punishments that had once been wielded like royal punctuation. Because if the restoration was to mean anything, it had to come with fire, spectacle, and entrails. Not metaphors, mind you. Royal justice had returned, and it was bringing the full weight of medieval imagination with it. 12. Charles II's revenge on regicides. When Charles II returned to England in 1660 after nearly a decade of exile, he was welcomed as the Restoration King, the answer to years of civil war, Republican rule, and the stern, God-fearing austerity of the Cromwellian regime. The monarchy was back. The court was decadent. The wigs were taller, the parties lasted longer. It was, by all appearances, a new era of merriment. But behind the powdered faces and velvet drapery, Charles carried a list, a long, meticulous list, of names. The men who had signed his father's death warrant, and he wanted them to pay. It wasn't just vengeance, it was ritual correction. In Charles's eyes, the beheading of Charles I in 1649 had not merely killed a king, it had torn a hole in the divine order. The monarchy was supposed to be appointed by God, which meant those who had laid hands on his father's life had not just committed murder. They had committed cosmic treason. That was the atmosphere in which Charles II began what would become one of the most calculated acts of royal reprisal in British history. To be clear, not every regicide was still alive when Charles came back. Some had died naturally, others fled the country, vanishing into Europe or the American colonies. But 29 men who had participated in Charles I's trial and execution were still within reach. Some tried to apologize, some offered legal defenses. Others, perhaps foolishly, stood by their actions. None of that mattered. A special court was established. The trials were swift. The charges were formal, treason against the crown, but the outcomes were inevitable. Charles didn't just want executions, he wanted statements. Public, unmistakable, unforgettable statements. And so, 12 of the surviving regicides were sentenced to the full medieval punishment for traitors, a method that had long served as the monarchy's preferred way of making sure no one mistook the execution of a political enemy for mere punishment. This was about transformation, a ritual of undoing, a way to take someone who had once held power and reduce them to silence, piece by piece. The executions began in October 1660. One by one, the condemned were brought to Charing Cross or Tyburn, tied to wooden frames, and subjected to the old rites of high treason. Crowds gathered. Broadsheets described the events in clinical detail. Royalists applauded, Puritans wept. Among the most famous of these was Thomas Harrison, a former general under Cromwell, and one of the most vocal proponents of Charles I's execution. His punishment was brutal, theatrical, and designed to erase him from memory while making sure the method of his end stayed burned into the public's mind. He reportedly climbed the scaffold calmly, even cheerfully, declaring that he acted according to his conscience. It didn't save him. Then came John Cook, the lawyer who had prosecuted the king. His fate was sealed before he even stood trial. Royalists considered him not just a legal functionary but a co-author of the crime. His attempts to defend his actions, arguing that a monarch was not above the law, were met with laughter in court. Over the following weeks, more followed. Hugh Peters, the fiery preacher who had roused support for the Republic. Adrian Scrope, John Carew, Thomas Scott. Men whose names had once echoed through Parliament now found themselves reduced to spectacles on wooden platforms, their fates broadcast as a new national theater. And yet, what makes this episode uniquely disturbing is how methodical it was. These weren't emotional reprisals. They were administrative. Signed, sealed, scheduled. There was a rhythm to it, almost procedural. It wasn't the fury of a monarch avenging his father in a rage. It was the cool, calculated machinery of a state reasserting its dominance through historical correction. But the message wasn't just aimed at the regicides. It was aimed at everyone. A performance for the country. A way of saying, this is what happens when you imagine the king can be tried like a common man. This is what happens when the sword of justice points upward instead of down. And it worked, at least in the short term. The monarchy was restabilized. Parliament fell in line. The Republic became a footnote. Charles II could play the merry monarch, attending masquerade balls and commissioning portraits of himself surrounded by mistresses, because the dirty work had already been done. But not all justice is loud, and not all enemies are found in courtrooms. Because the monarchy's greatest wounds weren't always inflicted by soldiers or statesmen. Sometimes, they came from inside the royal nursery. From the quiet corridors of palaces, where the crown weighed too heavily on bodies that were too small to bear it. And sometimes, the most devastating royal tragedies are the ones that never even reached adulthood. 13 Queen Anne's tragic pregnancies. In the grand gallery of British royalty, Queen Anne occupies a strange corner. No infamous executions, no bloody wars, no tyrannical proclamations echoing across the realm. And yet, her reign is quietly haunted by a different kind of violence. The slow, invisible, and deeply human kind. The kind that never made it into portraits or public declarations but lived instead in the quiet chambers of her private grief. Queen Anne ruled from 1702 to 1714, overseeing the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain and navigating a complex political landscape shaped by Whigs, Tories, and shifting religious alliances. But history tends to reduce her to two things: the creation of the United Kingdom and the unsettling fact that she was pregnant 17 times, and none of her children survived to adulthood. 17. It's a number that feels less like a statistic and more like a drumbeat of personal catastrophe. Each pregnancy began with hope. Each one ended in devastation. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died within hours. Children who lived just long enough to be named, baptized, mourned. The longest lived was William, Duke of Gloucester, who died at age 11 after a lifetime of illness and frailty. After that, there were no more survivors, just Anne and silence. And the silence was loud. For a queen, especially in the 17th and early 18th centuries, fertility was more than biology. It was national policy. An heir wasn't just a child. It was stability, continuity, proof that the divine right of kings or queens wasn't broken. Anne, despite her power, lived under the weight of expectations she could never fulfill. Each failed pregnancy wasn't just a private loss. It was a constitutional crisis. Behind palace doors, her repeated losses shaped everything: her health, her politics, her personal relationships. Anne suffered from a number of chronic conditions throughout her life, most notably gout and what appears in hindsight to be an autoimmune disorder that left her in constant pain and increasingly immobile. Toward the end of her reign, she was so swollen and inflamed that she had to be carried from room to room in a specially constructed sedan chair. But no physical ailment defined her more profoundly than her reproductive history. Historians often debate why Anne's pregnancies failed. Some suggest lupus, others diabetes, or Hughes syndrome, a rare blood clotting disorder that causes recurrent miscarriages. In her time, there were no medical explanations, only quiet blame, moral speculation, and the ever-present threat of divine judgment. Her court was filled with whispers about curses, about sin, about God's disfavor. And though few would have dared say it to her face, there was an unspoken tension. A queen who could not produce an heir was a queen who had failed in her most sacred duty. Anne's response to this pressure wasn't loud or dramatic. She withdrew, into ritual, into religion, into relationships that were, themselves, fraught with their own dramas. Chief among these was her friendship, later estranged, with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Theirs was a bond that began in youth, flourished into deep companionship, and eventually collapsed under the weight of political differences, emotional manipulation, and Anne's increasing dependence on those who offered her the loyalty she felt she wasn't getting elsewhere. Sarah was sharp, ambitious, and critical, qualities that once inspired Anne and later exhausted her. Their letters, voluminous, emotional, sometimes poetic, sometimes petty, reveal a relationship that blurred the lines between friendship, court politics, and emotional codependence. Some have speculated, controversially, that their relationship may have had romantic elements. Others read it as the desperate clinging of a woman who had lost too many people too many times. When their friendship fell apart, Anne turned to Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin, quieter, more compliant, more soothing. That shift caused a scandal that reverberated through court and parliament. But underneath the gossip and political maneuvering was a woman who, time and again, had buried her children, her friends, and her ability to trust. In many ways, Anne's reign was defined by absence. Not just the absence of children, but the absence of clear legacy. She was the last of the House of Stuart. Her failure to produce a surviving heir forced the political class to import a Protestant successor from Germany, George I, of the House of Hanover. He didn't speak English. He had no direct emotional connection to the country he was about to rule. But he was male, Protestant, and healthy, and that was enough. Anne died in 1714 at age 49, after years of declining health and increasing isolation. Her reign had seen wars, treaties, and political shifts, but her personal life remained the most tragic chapter. Her 17 lost pregnancies were more than private pain. They were national instability, dynastic collapse in slow motion. No portraits of Anne show her holding a child. No royal nursery echoes with her lineage. The legacy she left behind was not one of heirs, but of heartbreak. And if that sounds like a quieter kind of royal tragedy, don't be fooled. Because in the history of the British crown, grief often carries more political weight than glory. And when the grief turns inward, when the mind itself becomes the battlefield, it creates a monarch who rules not just a kingdom, but a chaos within. Which brings us to her grandfather, a king whose mind unraveled in public, whose body remained on the throne while his soul slipped further and further away. 14. George III's madness. Long before the name George became synonymous with royal stability, long before Britain's monarchy was defined by quiet diplomacy and soft power, there was George III, a king whose reign would stretch for nearly 60 years, through revolutions, wars, and the very public unraveling of his mind. In the portraits, he stands tall and composed, cloaked in velvet, hand resting authoritatively on the hilt of a ceremonial sword. But those images don't capture the man who, at the height of his mental collapse, was reportedly talking for hours without pause, mistaking trees for people, and losing track of who or where he was. What makes George III's story disturbing isn't just the decline, it's the scale of it. This was a monarch who began his reign with all the makings of a national patriarch. Responsible, pious, modest by royal standards, and genuinely concerned with the moral tone of his court. He read parliamentary papers diligently. He paid his debts. He was a family man, a loyal husband, and a devoted father to 15 children. He was, by the standards of 18th century European royalty, unglamorous, but competent. But slowly, and then suddenly, the shadows crept in. The first signs of illness came in the 1780s. At the time, they were brushed off as stress or overwork. After all, the king had just lost the American colonies, a national humiliation that shook his government and emboldened his critics. The loss of the colonies wasn't just a military failure, it was a personal one. George had pushed hard to hold on to them, refusing to concede even as his generals faltered. The psychological toll was immense, but still, no one expected what came next. He began speaking rapidly, unable to stop. His letters grew erratic. He stopped sleeping. He would alternate between hyperactive energy and crushing melancholy. He obsessed over religious guilt, fixated on divine punishment, and fell into prolonged states of confusion. The court physicians, more equipped for fevers and fractures than for the complexities of the human psyche, were baffled. And like so many before and after them, they turned to restraint. Restraint meant isolation, straitjackets, cold baths, silence. George was moved to secluded residences, kept away from public view. Not because his condition was being cured, but because it was being contained. The monarchy, after all, could not afford to appear fragile. Historians now believe George III suffered from a hereditary disorder, most likely porphyria, a rare blood condition that can affect the nervous system and cause symptoms mimicking psychiatric illness. Others argue for bipolar disorder or severe depression with psychotic features. Whatever the diagnosis, the result was the same. A king on the throne in name, but not in mind. In 1788, his first major episode became impossible to hide. Parliament was thrown into crisis. Could a monarch who didn't recognize his ministers still legally appoint them? Could he sign laws? Could he reign at all? A regency bill was prepared to install his son, the future George IV, as acting monarch. But just as the legislation neared completion, George recovered, almost miraculously. He returned to public life, declared himself cured, and ruled for another decade. But the reprieve was temporary. By 1801, the signs returned. More episodes, more silence, more medical theater disguised as treatment. His beloved youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, died in 1810, and that final loss seemed to push him past the point of no return. He retreated fully from public life. By 1811, he was deemed unfit to rule, and a formal regency was enacted, this time permanently. For the last 9 years of his life, George III was king in name only, blind, deaf, and reportedly unaware that he was no longer ruling. His mental state so deteriorated that even family members were barred from seeing him. He lived in Windsor Castle, wandering its rooms and grounds, murmuring to himself, holding conversations no one else could follow. Occasionally, he would think he was giving orders. Sometimes, he believed he was already dead. And through it all, the state carried on. That's perhaps the most unsettling part. The machinery of monarchy didn't stop. Parliament passed laws. Wars were fought. Treaties signed. The world changed, and the figure at the center of the constitutional order was locked in a private mental spiral, preserved in place but absent in presence. He died in 1820, a shadow of the figure once crowned in Westminster Abbey. By then, the narrative had shifted. Mad King George had become both punchline and parable. In Britain he was pitied. In America remembered as the tyrant from whom they had broken free. And in medical textbooks, he became a case study, a monarch turned metaphor. But George III's story isn't just about illness. It's about the fragile boundary between power and perception. What happens when the most powerful person in the country no longer understands what power is? What does it mean to have a sovereign who cannot recognize his own sovereignty? And more hauntingly, how long can a nation pretend that nothing's wrong? Because the British monarchy has always been skilled at appearances. But beneath those appearances, it has often concealed pain, illness, grief, fear, and in some cases, outright brutality. And as George III's body failed his mind, his generals and commanders were carrying out orders in his name that reeked not of mercy, but of vengeance. One of them was a prince, a duke, a war hero, and a man whose legacy would forever be stained with a single word: butcher. 15-Butcher, Cumberland's Atrocities, 1746. Some royal nicknames are flattering. The Virgin Queen. The Merry Monarch. Even the Mad King, in its tragic way, offers a kind of mythic dignity. But then there's Butcher Cumberland, a title that sticks like blood to silk, earned not through scandal or satire, but through deliberate military action carried out in the name of the crown. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a condemnation etched into history by those who survived what he did, or more often, by those who didn't. Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, was the third and youngest son of King George II. He was never expected to be king, but he was expected to do something useful. In 18th century Britain, useful for a spare royal usually meant joining the army. Cumberland did exactly that, rising quickly through the ranks, helped, of course, by his royal blood, and soon became a symbol of Hanoverian might, broad-shouldered, decisive, and deeply committed to maintaining order, whatever the cost. That cost became horrifyingly clear in 1746, at the Battle of Culloden, the last pitched battle fought on British soil. To understand Culloden, you have to back up to the Jacobite Risings, a series of rebellions aimed at restoring the exiled House of Stuart to the British throne. These uprisings had simmered for decades, flaring whenever political chaos or royal unpopularity gave them oxygen. But the 1745 uprising, led by Charles Edward Stuart, known romantically as Bonnie Prince Charlie, was the most serious threat the Hanoverians had faced. Charles, the grandson of the deposed James II, landed in Scotland and rallied a force of Highland clans, promising to restore the Stuart line and roll back decades of Protestant ascendancy. His campaign was shockingly successful at first. The Jacobites marched south, reaching as far as Derby, just 125 miles from London. But logistical problems, lack of support from English Catholics, and internal disagreement forced a retreat back to Scotland. And that's where Cumberland came in. Tasked with crushing the rebellion, the Duke of Cumberland took command of government forces and pursued the Jacobite army northward. What followed was a brutal, methodical, and, most disturbingly, highly efficient campaign. It culminated in the boggy fields of Culloden Moor near Inverness on April 16, 1746. The battle itself was short. The Jacobites, outnumbered and poorly supplied, charged into musket and cannon fire. Cumberland's troops held their lines and decimated the advancing Highlanders. It was a massacre. The Jacobite line collapsed within an hour. Hundreds were killed. Many more fled. But it wasn't the battle that earned Cumberland his dark epithet. It was what happened after. Cumberland ordered a policy of no quarter. That meant no mercy for the wounded, no acceptance of surrender. His soldiers were instructed to pursue retreating Jacobites and eliminate them, even if they were unarmed or already injured. The moor became a field of executions. Civilians suspected of aiding the rebels were targeted. Homes were burned, livestock slaughtered. Entire Highland communities were uprooted. It wasn't just punishment, it was eradication. And it wasn't subtle. Cumberland wanted the Highlands pacified, not just militarily, but culturally. The wearing of tartan and Highland dress was outlawed. The clan system, with its distinct language, loyalty networks, and resistance to central authority, was systematically dismantled. In effect, the government used Culloden as an opportunity to forcibly rewrite the Scottish Highlands in the image of loyal Britain. In London, Cumberland was celebrated. He was hailed as the savior of the realm, awarded thanks by Parliament, and showered with praise by a frightened aristocracy relieved that the rebellion had been crushed. But in Scotland, and particularly among the Highlanders, his name became a curse. Butcher Cumberland was scrawled in ballads, muttered in Gaelic, and passed down from generation to generation, not as history, but as living memory. Even those sympathetic to the Hanoverian cause struggled to defend the post-battle policies. Some accounts from English soldiers expressed unease at the sheer scale of violence. Others admitted privately that what had happened was not a military victory, but a cleansing. Over time, Cumberland's reputation deteriorated. He was mocked in satire. His political influence declined. His military failures in later campaigns, particularly in the 7 Years' War, further tarnished his legacy. But nothing ever erased what happened at Culloden. And the monarchy? It moved on, as it always does. The Highland clearances that followed in later decades continued the process Cumberland had begun, displacing Scottish communities in the name of progress and profit. The clans faded, the culture faded, and the language faded. But the story didn't. Because Culloden wasn't just a defeat, it was a turning point, a moment when a British prince earned a title no coronation could erase. And if the story of Butcher Cumberland reveals what the crown can do in the open, then the next tale takes us somewhere more hidden. Behind palace walls, into the quiet tragedy of a child who was born royal, but lived like a secret. A prince whose very existence was treated as an inconvenience, and whose life, by royal design, was erased from memory before it had even begun. 16. Prince John, hidden away, 1905 to 1909. He was the fifth son of King George V and Queen Mary, a prince, a royal, a member of the most visible family in the British Empire. And yet for much of his short life, Prince John of the United Kingdom was hidden in plain sight, a shadow in a golden palace. He wasn't disinherited. He wasn't exiled. He was something stranger, politely, systematically, and quietly removed from public consciousness. Born in 1905, Prince John was by all initial accounts a healthy and happy child. He played with his siblings, posed for formal portraits, and participated in early family outings. But something changed as he aged. He began to experience developmental delays. He had difficulty with speech, comprehension, and physical coordination. By the time he was around 4 years old, signs of epilepsy and autism were becoming apparent. And in a royal household fixated on order, decorum, and a very narrow definition of perfection, this posed a problem. The early 20th century was not a compassionate time for neurodivergence or chronic illness, especially not in elite families whose lives were stage-managed down to the minute. In aristocratic circles, disability was often treated as a flaw to be covered, or worse, corrected. And for royals, it posed a threat to the image of hereditary superiority. After all, if kings and queens ruled by divine right, what did it mean when their children didn't fit the mold? The palace response to John's condition was, on the surface, measured. He was not imprisoned, nor overtly mistreated. Instead, the process of his disappearance was gradual. Public appearances stopped. His name began to vanish from official reports. He was moved from royal residences to a secluded estate, Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, where he was placed under the care of a governess and a rotating staff. There, away from the public eye, Prince John lived out the rest of his short life. He was given some freedom to roam the grounds. He played with animals. He enjoyed mechanical toys and puzzles. But outside that quiet world, Britain marched forward. World War I raged. The monarchy rebranded itself, shifting from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor to distance itself from its German roots. And through it all, John's absence was rarely, if ever, mentioned. He died in 1919 at the age of 13 after a severe seizure in the early hours of the morning. His parents were informed, but did not arrive in time to see him alive. A small funeral was held. No great public mourning followed. Newspapers published modest, restrained obituaries, and then, as if on cue, the monarchy resumed its business. What's chilling isn't just the secrecy. It's how normal the secrecy was. How the erasure of a disabled royal child was treated as routine, appropriate, even compassionate. In official palace narratives, John was described as delicate, sensitive, better off in the countryside. The implication was clear. His removal from public life was not cruelty, but kindness, an act of shielding, not shame. But historians and biographers have since peeled back that narrative. Accounts from staff at Wood Farm suggest John was lively, humorous, and deeply affectionate. Far from a burden, he was a child with needs, ones that a modern understanding of autism and epilepsy would have better addressed. Instead, he was written out of the story. Today, Prince John is often referred to as the Lost Prince, and the term fits, not because he disappeared, but because he was deliberately misplaced. His story isn't just about disability. It's about image management, about what happens when a family known for visibility decides that one of their own would be better left unseen. But even in his absence, Prince John left a trace, a quiet indictment of royal perfectionism, an uncomfortable reminder that sometimes the harshest exile doesn't require a prison. Just a closed door and a decision not to look back. And while Queen Mary mourned her son in private, she never spoke publicly about his condition. Not once. Because the crown, like the rest of the world, prefers its vulnerabilities out of view, preferably behind lace curtains, preferably in silence. But some forms of grief are harder to hide, especially when they last decades. Which brings us to another royal, one whose mourning was so consuming, so immersive, that it blurred the line between loss and obsession, a queen who made her sorrow into a ritual, and her husband's death into a second permanent resident in the royal bedroom. 17 Victoria's morbid mourning. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria didn't just lose her husband. She lost her compass, her confidence, and, by many accounts, her interest in life itself. What followed wasn't a period of mourning. It was a transformation. For the next 40 years, until her own death in 1901, Victoria became the high priestess of grief, conducting a royal ritual of absence, so elaborate, it blurred the line between reverence and obsession. Albert, the German-born prince consort, had been the architect of much of Victoria's reign. He managed her correspondence, advised her on matters of state, and reshaped the monarchy's public image. His death, likely from typhoid fever, was a psychological blow she never recovered from. In the immediate aftermath, Victoria withdrew from public view entirely. She wore black mourning clothes, not for a season, but for the rest of her life. She avoided state functions, refused to appear in public, and transformed every royal residence into a kind of living memorial. His clothes were left untouched. His shaving brush sat unused by the sink. His inkwell was refilled daily. His rooms were kept warm. At Osborne House, their private retreat, Servants continued to lay out his clothes and bring him hot water in the mornings, as if he might return at any moment. Visitors described an atmosphere suspended in time, frozen in the moment of Albert's departure. Some called it romantic, others called it pathological. The British public, at first sympathetic, grew impatient. They wanted their queen back, wanted visibility, leadership, a return to ceremonial life. But Victoria insisted that duty to grief outranked all other obligations. Her seclusion sparked a temporary Republican movement. Newspapers asked pointed questions, and political tensions simmered. But over time, the public fascination with her mourning began to mirror her own. Mourning became fashion. Black crepe and jet jewelry became cultural markers. Funerary customs, already elaborate in Victorian society, grew increasingly ornate. The Queen had turned personal sorrow into national identity. This wasn't just about Albert. Victoria had always been emotionally intense, given to extremes. But Albert had been her anchor. His death exposed her lifelong dependency, psychological, political, even spiritual. Without him, she retreated into relationships with servants and staff who filled the emotional void, most famously John Brown, the blunt Scottish attendant who became her closest companion and, according to palace gossip, possibly something more. She would later grow equally attached to Abdul Karim, an Indian servant she elevated to positions that scandalized her household. In both cases, Victoria sought not advisors, but surrogates, people who could offer presence without the threat of replacement. What's unsettling is how the machinery of monarchy adapted around her mourning. Ministers met her in her private chambers. Ceremonies were shortened or skipped. Portraits of Albert multiplied in royal residences. Death didn't interrupt governance. It haunted it. Even her own children became supporting characters in the performance of her grief. She referred to Albert as the dear angel, spoke of him in the present tense, and openly wept at state occasions. She was, in a sense, her own widow-in-chief, personifying sorrow as a kind of permanent constitutional role. Victoria died in 1901, still dressed in black. Her funeral instructions were clear. She was to be buried with Albert's dressing gown, a plaster cast of his hand, and personal mementos from their life together. She had already chosen the burial site. She had already written the epitaph. And so, the most powerful woman in the world chose to be remembered not as a queen in glory, but as a wife in mourning. Not a ruler who had governed an empire, but a widow who never stopped setting the dinner table for two. It's easy to romanticize that level of devotion, but beneath it lies a disturbing question. When does love become erasure? When does memory become mausoleum? And more haunting still, what happens when the body you're mourning never stopped being your own? Because the next royal didn't wait for death to arrive. He invited it in, again, and again, and again. 18. Prince Albert's obsession with bloodletting. It's not often that the consort of a monarch becomes one of the most influential figures in British political, architectural, and scientific life. Yet Prince Albert managed it. As Queen Victoria's husband, he was no mere decoration. He reshaped everything from royal finances to urban planning, championed the arts and sciences, and left behind a towering legacy most clearly embodied in the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition of 1851. But the most haunting thing about Albert's legacy isn't what he built. It's what he believed about the human body. Because behind the polished exterior of the well-dressed reformer and forward-thinking intellectual was a man who, when his health began to fail, turned not to science, but to the darkest medical fads of his time. And he followed them with a kind of morbid conviction that seems almost medieval. Prince Albert's final years were a slow-motion collapse. By the late 1850s, he was worn thin by stress, illness, and the unrelenting burden of managing a monarch who had no desire to manage anything herself. He took on much of the administrative work that Victoria shunned, often pushing himself far beyond the limits of physical health. His letters from the period reveal a man increasingly anxious, fatigued, and convinced that his ailments were more moral than medical. And so, when the aches, fevers, and malaise began creeping in, Albert did what many 19th century men of his class and education did. He placed his trust in bloodletting. By then, the practice was already falling out of favor in medical circles. But in some royal households, old habits die hard. The idea behind it was simple. Illness was caused by an imbalance of the body's humors, and draining blood could restore balance. The more serious the illness, the more drastic the bloodletting. Sometimes this was done with lancets, sometimes with leeches, sometimes repeatedly, even daily. Albert, already physically weakened, subjected himself to this procedure with a kind of tragic enthusiasm. Every new symptom was treated as a sign of excess, every discomfort a prompt for the lancet, and with every treatment, his health declined further. Modern historians now believe Albert may have suffered from Crohn's disease, or possibly a chronic infection like typhoid that had flared into something more systemic. But without antibiotics or skepticism, he was caught in a loop, sick, drained, weakened, and made sicker by the very treatments meant to heal him. And what's most unsettling is how personal it all became. Victoria, deeply reliant on Albert for emotional and political stability, watched helplessly as he deteriorated. Her letters from this time are filled with dread, confusion, and denial. She believed he was merely overworked, or overtired, or spiritually afflicted. She encouraged the rest cures, the retreats to Osborne, the endless bleeding sessions, never quite seeing that each remedy was only deepening the damage. When he died in December 1861, at just 42 years old, the official cause of death was listed as typhoid fever. But many now believe his death was less about disease than it was about devotion to bad medicine. His trust in outdated remedies didn't just fail him, it actively hastened his end. The man who had brought modern thinking to Britain's institutions had placed his own body in the hands of medieval theory, a contradiction so sharp it almost seems designed, and in that contradiction lies a darker truth. Even the most rational minds are vulnerable when fear, fatigue, and legacy collide. Victoria never recovered. As we've seen, her mourning became a national doctrine, a kind of second reign in Albert's shadow. But what rarely gets mentioned is how much of Albert's decline had been sanctioned by that very royal machinery, endorsed by doctors, facilitated by staff, and carried out within walls designed to look untouchable. He died not in battle or scandal, but in slow surrender to a system that revered tradition above evidence. The crown had lost its compass, and the man who once symbolized modernity died surrounded by velvet, candlelight, and the soft hiss of leeches in a bowl. But while Albert's end was shaped by an outdated idea of medicine, the next royal tragedy was shaped by a very modern kind of moral sickness. One that wasn't hidden in palaces or dressed in lace. One that smiled, shook hands, made speeches, and admired a regime built on cruelty. Because the next king didn't bleed himself to death. He flirted with fascism. 19. Edward VIII's Nazi ties. In 1936, King Edward VIII gave up the British throne in order to marry a twice-divorced American named Wallis Simpson. At the time, the move was hailed as the ultimate romantic sacrifice, a modern fairy tale about love conquering duty. What went mostly unspoken, however, was that abdication may have been the least disturbing thing about him. Because when the dust of the romance settled, a far more unsettling story began to emerge. One not of scandal or sentimentality, but of ideological proximity to fascism and personal admiration for Adolf Hitler. Edward, even before taking the throne, had long expressed views that alarmed some and intrigued others. He was deeply skeptical of democracy, disdainful of parliamentary procedure, and infatuated with the idea of strong, centralized leadership. His letters and private conversations suggest a man who saw the turbulence of the 1930s not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. After his abdication, Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor and shuffled away from the epicenter of British politics. But he remained high profile enough that his movements and his affiliations mattered. In 1937, less than a year after leaving the throne, he and Wallace took a trip to Germany, where they met with top Nazi officials, and most notably, with Hitler himself. Photographs from the visit show the former king giving what appears to be a Nazi salute. He toured military facilities. He received diplomatic honors. He smiled politely in rooms where plans for global war were already being drawn. And while some dismissed the visit as poor judgment or naivety, British intelligence and American diplomats began sounding alarms. Declassified files released decades later revealed something far more serious, that Nazi officials believed Edward could be instrumental in forming a pro-German British government, if and when Germany succeeded in invading the UK. There are suggestions, unconfirmed but persistent, that the Nazis even drafted plans, codenamed Operation Willy, to kidnap or co-opt the Duke and reinstate him as a puppet monarch should they occupy Britain. Was Edward complicit or simply careless? The line between sympathy and sedition is thin when a former king openly praises a genocidal regime. What's clear is that Edward continued to express views sympathetic to fascist governance even after the full scope of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. Wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, aware of the potential embarrassment and risk Edward posed, quietly arranged for him to be sent to the Bahamas as governor, an honorific position that served less as a reward and more as a polite exile. Out of sight, out of headlines, and ideally, out of trouble. And that's where Edward remained, technically part of the royal family, but never again a central figure. The fairy tale romance that had so enchanted the public became a postscript to a much darker chapter. In private, Edward continued to complain about his treatment, blamed the Jews for international unrest, and wonder aloud why his friend Adolf had gone so far. Today, the monarchy rarely speaks of this chapter. Edward's portraits still hang, his titles remain in the record books, and the story is often reduced to the drama of abdication. But buried just beneath the romance is the much more disturbing possibility that the man who once wore the British crown stood perilously close to the wrong side of history, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a willing admirer of authoritarian power. And while Edward's leanings were ideological, the next royal scandal was far more visceral. Because up next is a monarch who ruled not with theories, but with his stomach. A king whose excesses became a national joke, and whose body collapsed under the weight of his own appetites. 20. George IV's excessive gluttony. George IV, long before his coronation, was already infamous, not for his political achievements or military exploits, but for his staggering devotion to excess. Excess in fashion, excess in architecture, excess in spending, and above all, excess in eating and drinking. He didn't just indulge, he transformed indulgence into identity. And as the British Empire expanded across the globe, its Prince Regent sat at the center of it all, growing in grandeur and in girth, until the monarchy itself seemed like it might buckle beneath his weight. Born in 1762, George Augustus Frederick was the eldest son of King George III. As Prince of Wales, he was every bit the counterpoint to his pious, mentally unstable father. Where George III embraced domesticity and Christian virtue, George IV chased pleasure as policy. He threw lavish parties, dressed in silk and diamonds, and cultivated a personal aesthetic somewhere between Versailles and Theatre Curtain. He patronized the arts, yes, but also every luxury and vice within arm's reach. His eating habits were legendary, even in his own time. Lavish banquets were not the exception. They were routine. Multiple course meals with whole game birds, overflowing dessert trays, imported wines, and liquors of every variety. He reportedly drank a bottle of laudanum a day in his later years, not for any specific pain, but as part of a daily ritual of intoxication and sedation. Physicians warned him repeatedly that his lifestyle was killing him. He nodded politely, then asked for more pudding. He wasn't just a glutton in the culinary sense. George IV consumed things: houses, titles, reputations, public funds. He personally commissioned the extravagant redesign of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a bizarre and opulent Indo-Saracenic fantasy that looked like an imperial fever dream landed on a seaside town. He spared no expense, both metaphorically and literally. By the time he was crowned, his personal debts totaled over £600,000, the modern equivalent of tens of millions. Politically, he was a constitutional monarch with very little real power, but that didn't stop him from attempting to wield influence behind the scenes, usually to protect his own image or settle old grudges. His relationships were chaotic, particularly with Parliament, which despised both his extravagance and his hypocrisy. But the real tragedy of George IV isn't that he was selfish. It's that he was fragile, psychologically, physically, and emotionally. By the time he became king in 1820, he could barely walk unaided. His waistline ballooned to over 50 inches, and he suffered from gout, dropsy, and a host of other ailments related to decades of overindulgence. Servants reportedly had to carry him upstairs, and his skin became so inflamed that he wore special garments to reduce friction. He sweated constantly, he drank constantly, he was in constant pain. And yet, the public image he cultivated remained one of grandeur. His coronation robe alone cost over £24,000, a statement of excess from a man who could no longer stand comfortably for more than a few minutes. His court became a parody of aristocratic bloating. Foreign dignitaries were baffled. British citizens, taxed and overworked, watched as their monarch disappeared beneath layers of velvet and self-importance. Toward the end of his life, he rarely appeared in public, retreating into isolation and consumption. His internal organs were so compromised that one contemporary wrote, "His body is like a rotting barrel, distended with its own decay." Again, the physicians pleaded. Again, he ignored them. He died in 1830, bloated, delirious, and deeply unpopular. He left behind no legitimate heirs, a kingdom tired of ceremony, and a monarchy desperate for moral rehabilitation. His own mother reportedly said of him, "My son is a complete disgrace to us all." Parliament didn't weep. Neither did the people. George IV's story is more than gluttony. It's a case study in what happens when royal privilege meets zero resistance, when appetite is treated as birthright, when weakness is dressed in gold braid and mistaken for majesty. His body became a metaphor for the monarchy itself, overfed, overextended, and badly in need of reform. But at least George had the dignity of dying behind a curtain. The next king on our list kept something far more unsettling in view, a child-sized coffin placed out in the open for all to see. Because grief, in royal hands, is rarely private. Sometimes it's displayed like a trophy. 21. James II and infant coffins. By the time James II came to the throne in 1685, the monarchy had already survived civil war, regicide, and religious whiplash. Protestantism was now firmly established in English political identity, and the scars of the Stuart legacy still lingered. James, the younger brother of Charles II, inherited a throne that was more stable than it had been in decades, but he also inherited distrust, and he carried with him the one trait the English elite feared more than tyranny: Catholicism. A convert to Rome, James made no effort to hide his faith. He surrounded himself with Catholic advisors, encouraged the tolerance of Catholic worship, and made public gestures that alarmed the Anglican establishment. But what truly unsettled the nation wasn't just religion, it was the prospect of a Catholic dynasty. And nowhere did that fear crystallize more than in his tragic and deeply bizarre attachment to a tiny coffin. James had many children, most of whom died in infancy. Child mortality was tragically common at the time, but James seemed to linger on these losses. One in particular, a stillborn child, was mourned in a way that raised eyebrows, even by 17th century standards. Instead of a quiet burial, James reportedly kept the small coffin on display in one of his private chambers, visible to courtiers, advisors, and foreign envoys alike. It wasn't a temporary shrine. It was permanent. A small white casket, possibly made of wood and draped in fabric, containing the remains of a baby who never drew breath, placed deliberately in the heart of the royal household. Some accounts claim he spoke to it. Others say he used it to guilt or manipulate visitors, pressing the physical weight of his sorrow into diplomatic and political conversations. The effect was chilling. Mourning is one thing, but displayed grief, ritualized, curated, and continually performed, becomes something else entirely. For many observers, the coffin became a symbol of James's instability, not just emotional, but ideological. A Catholic king keeping a dead child in view felt to Protestant England like a fusion of foreign superstition, morbidity, and divine punishment. Even James's supporters found the gesture difficult to defend, and it played into a larger narrative, that the king was ruled not by reason but by faith, by emotion, and by the ghosts of children who never lived. The final blow came with the birth of a healthy son, James Francis Edward, in 1688. Protestants across the land panicked. A Catholic heir meant a Catholic future. Whispers spread that the child had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan, a bizarre conspiracy theory that persists in royal folklore. But true or not, it spoke to the depth of public paranoia. Later that year, the Glorious Revolution forced James to flee into exile. He died in France, in relative obscurity, his dynasty broken, his infant son raised in the shadow of a kingdom that no longer wanted him. The infant coffin, like the man who kept it, vanished into history. But the image remains. A small casket in a royal room, acting as both memorial and mirror. A reminder that monarchy isn't just about legacy. Sometimes it's about loss, held too tightly and shown too often. And next, we turn to a king who didn't just lose his grip on politics or power, but on reality itself. A ruler so far removed from the present that time, speech, and even identity became impossible puzzles. 22. Henry VI's religious madness. The image of a medieval king often conjures something between a warlord and a chess piece. Strong, strategic, decisive, cloaked in chainmail or velvet, depending on the century. But Henry VI, England's 15th century monarch, confounded that image at every turn. He was not strong. He was not strategic. And at the height of his reign, he was not even conscious of it. While others schemed, Henry sat, motionless, vacant, unreachable, as his kingdom burned around him. Born in 1421, Henry became King of England at just 9 months old, following the death of his father, Henry V. Then, months later, he inherited the French crown too, via his mother, Catherine of Valois. Technically, this made him king of 2 powerful realms. In practice, it made him a royal infant caught between 2 crumbling empires. His minority reign was governed by powerful regents, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how little Henry ever grew into the role he inherited. From early adolescence, he displayed signs of a fragile and highly passive temperament. He had little interest in court politics, no real appetite for war, and an almost obsessive devotion to prayer, fasting, and spiritual reflection. Religious piety is one thing, but Henry took it to extremes. He preferred monasteries to councils, silence to speeches. He was reportedly disturbed by acts of violence, even symbolic ones, and often seemed unequipped to make even basic decisions. His contemporaries described him as gentle, kindly, and devout, but also vague, passive, and easily overwhelmed. He was, in every way, a man out of step with his era. And then, in 1453, something snapped. That summer, Henry suffered what modern scholars now believe was a complete psychological collapse. For over a year, he was completely unresponsive, not merely melancholic or withdrawn, but catatonic. He did not speak. He did not move. He did not recognize his own wife or react to the birth of his only son, Edward of Westminster. It was as if the crown had emptied him out entirely. Historians have speculated for centuries about the cause. Some point to hereditary mental illness. His maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, suffered from similar episodes of madness. Others cite stress, poor health, or spiritual strain from his relentless religiosity. But the result was the same. England was left with a monarch physically alive but mentally absent. During this episode, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector of the realm, and from there, the kingdom plunged into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal series of dynastic conflicts that turned noble families against one another and stained the English countryside with decades of civil war. Henry briefly recovered, only to relapse. His moments of lucidity became fewer and shorter. When he was well, he deferred to others. When he was unwell, the machinery of government spun in circles around his silence. He became a pawn, claimed by both the House of Lancaster, his own line, and the House of York, who saw in his weakness an opportunity to advance their own claim. He was captured, deposed, restored, and captured again. His life turned into a macabre game of royal hot potato, passed between factions like a relic too sacred to break, but too dangerous to hold. He died in the Tower of London in 1471, under suspicious circumstances, almost certainly murdered. But by then, the myth had already taken hold. The king who prayed while his kingdom burned. A man so pious he could not rule. So passive he could not act. So broken he could not survive. Henry VI remains one of the most tragic figures in British royal history, not because he was evil or incompetent, but because he was unfit in a uniquely spiritual way. His reign is a warning about the limits of virtue in a world that demands violence, about what happens when power is inherited by someone who wants only to escape it. And if Henry VI lived in fear of his own mind, the next king faced a rather different indignity. His body, not his soul, became the center of the spectacle. Because when William the Conqueror died, he left behind not just an empire, but a corpse so bloated it refused to stay buried. 23. William the Conqueror's exploding corpse, 1087. There are few ways to die that feel both mythic and absurd, but William the Conqueror somehow managed it. The man who changed the course of English history with the Battle of Hastings in 1066, who ended Anglo-Saxon rule and redefined the monarchy as a continental, centralized force of unprecedented ambition, left the world in a condition that can only be described as chaotically symbolic. His death was not grand. It was not poetic. It was logistically catastrophic. William had ruled England for over 2 decades, wielding both brutality and bureaucracy to bend the realm to his will. He built castles, conducted surveys, and rewrote land ownership in ways that still echo today. But by 1087, the great conqueror had grown large, physically and politically. He was severely overweight, possibly suffering from chronic illness, and had become increasingly brutal in his later years. His final campaign was one of vengeance. After a rebellion in Normandy, he set fire to the city of Mantes. But during the campaign, his horse reared violently, and William was thrown against the saddle pommel, rupturing his abdomen. He survived the fall, but barely. Over the next few weeks, he deteriorated rapidly. Internal injuries, fever and infection set in. He was taken to Rouen, where he lay dying in a monastery. According to chroniclers, his final days were filled with regret, religious reflection, and political calculation. He confessed his sins. He gave away wealth to the church. He tried to secure the futures of his squabbling sons. Then he died, unremarkably, quietly, a conqueror reduced to silence. And that's when the real trouble began. First, the room was looted. Monks and attendants, fearing chaos, fled with valuables. His body was left unattended for hours. Then came the funeral, rushed, underfunded, and poorly organized. William's body was transported to Caen, to be buried at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, which he himself had founded decades earlier. But by the time it arrived, the corpse had bloated significantly. The summer heat and the days of neglect had taken their toll. As the monks tried to lower the body into a stone sarcophagus, one reportedly too small for his girth, they ran into a very practical problem. The body didn't fit. Accounts vary slightly, but the consensus is grim. When they tried to force the corpse into the tomb, the pressure caused a rupture, a violent rupture. The room reportedly filled with an unbearable stench, and mourners fled in horror. A scene meant to reflect triumph became something closer to farce. And then, like a punchline, the burial concluded. Quickly, quietly. The abbey was cleaned. The crown moved on. But the symbolism lingered. The man who had conquered England, who had crossed the sea, broken a kingdom, and crowned himself in Westminster, could not even fit into his own grave. His body rejected the dignity that history tried to assign him. And perhaps, in that moment, the medieval world got its final revenge, a reminder that even kings rot. Even emperors swell. Even the greatest names in history can end in logistical failure. Today, his grave in Caen remains. But his bones have not rested peacefully. The tomb was disturbed during the French Wars of Religion, desecrated during the Revolution, and rearranged multiple times. Only a single thigh bone is thought to remain. William the Conqueror's legacy is permanent. But his body? Not so much. And next comes a king who, like William, ruled through fear. But his enemies weren't French barons or rebel nobles. They were Scottish patriots. Rebels. Martyrs. And he dealt with them not through strategy or diplomacy, but through the most spectacular punishments the crown could devise. 24. Edward I's cruelty to the Scots. If England has a long memory, then Scotland has a longer grudge. And at the very center of that grudge, etched into statues, ballads, and inherited bitterness, is Edward I, known to history as Longshanks and to Scottish legend as the Hammer of the Scots. He was tall, iron-willed, and utterly relentless. He didn't just want to rule Scotland. He wanted to erase its independence, grind down its pride, and make sure every rebellious act was repaid with something unforgettable. He succeeded in some ways, but the violence required to hold that crown over two nations would leave wounds that would never quite heal. Edward I ruled from 1272 to 1307, and he's often remembered as one of England's most effective medieval kings. He was a reformer in law, a master of military logistics, and a builder of castles that still dominate the British landscape. But behind the admiration lies a reality soaked in conquest, particularly in the way he handled Scotland's refusal to be conquered. When the Scottish throne became vacant in 1290, Edward seized the moment. He offered to arbitrate between competing claimants, only to install John Balliol as a puppet king, one who owed his allegiance directly to Edward. It didn't last. Balliol pushed back, and Edward responded by invading Scotland in 1296. He sacked Berwick-upon-Tweed, reportedly killing thousands of civilians. Then he marched through the country with such force that even the Scottish nobility began to submit. He took the Stone of Scone, the ancient symbol of Scottish monarchy, and brought it to Westminster Abbey, a symbolic theft that would echo for centuries. But resistance returned in the form of William Wallace, a knight who led guerrilla campaigns against English occupation. Wallace wasn't noble by birth, which made his uprising even more threatening. He represented a different kind of defiance, and Edward took it personally. When Wallace was eventually captured in 1305, Edward made his punishment a national demonstration. He was transported to London, paraded before the public, and subjected to the most theatrical form of royal justice available. His limbs were sent to the four corners of the kingdom as a warning. His head, dipped in tar, was placed on London Bridge. Edward wanted to make it clear. Rebellion was not just treason. It was blasphemy against the divine order. And yet rebellion continued. Robert the Bruce rose next, more tactically refined than Wallace and more politically ambitious. Edward, already aging and sickly, launched another campaign to crush Bruce and reassert English dominance. He died en route in 1307, still dressed for war. According to legend, his final wish was that his bones be carried into battle against the Scots. They weren't. But the war went on, led by his son Edward II, with far less success. And eventually, Robert the Bruce would defeat the English at Bannockburn and reclaim Scotland's independence, at least for a time. So what did Edward I achieve? In England, he's often remembered as the king who built legal institutions and brought order to chaos. In Scotland, he is remembered very differently, as a symbol of conquest, arrogance, and cruelty. His campaigns were not just military operations. They were efforts to crush a culture. And perhaps most disturbing of all, he saw it all as justified. He believed deeply in the righteousness of his mission, that his power came not just from crown and sword, but from God, which made any resistance to him, in his mind, a moral failing to be corrected, not negotiated. Edward I built monuments, but he also left scars, many of which still shape the relationship between England and Scotland today. But if Edward's brutality was a matter of military conquest, the next royal darkness was stranger, a blend of folklore, superstition, and whispered rituals. Because some royal households weren't satisfied with swords or decrees, they reached for something older, something redder, something that, according to rumor, came from the body itself. 25. Elizabeth Bathory-like practices at court. The British monarchy has always taken its medicines seriously, sometimes with results that baffle modern sensibilities. There were leeches, mercury, arsenic tonics, and the regular application of blisters to balance the humors. But in certain chapters of royal history, the line between treatment and ritual blurred into something much darker. And if the whispers are to be believed, some members of the court believed that youth, beauty, and vitality could be restored not by prayer or medicine, but by blood. Now let's be clear. There is no verified evidence that British royals bathed in blood, a la the infamous Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who allegedly tortured and murdered hundreds of girls in a frenzy of beauty obsession. But British history does include a persistent pattern of bizarre, morbid medical practices that circle eerily close to that territory. One such trend involved the belief in king's touch. It was widely accepted from the medieval period through the 18th century that monarchs could cure scrofula, also known as the king's evil, by laying hands on the afflicted. Patients would line up by the hundreds, and the monarch would ceremonially touch each one, sometimes accompanied by prayers, sometimes in complete silence. What does that have to do with blood? The ritual wasn't just symbolic. It was believed to transmit divine essence through skin-to-skin contact. And in later years, as scientific medicine failed to fully take over, a number of private physicians to the royal household began exploring the use of human biological material in treatment. This included blood, organs, and bodily fluids, often harvested in ethically questionable ways. One infamous example was corpse medicine, a practice that involved the consumption of powders made from human remains, believed to contain life-preserving properties. Royal apothecaries occasionally prescribed mummy powder, yes, actual ground-up mummies imported from Egypt, as a remedy for everything from epilepsy to melancholy. In some circles, blood was seen as the most powerful essence of all. Fresh human blood taken from healthy young donors was rumored to restore energy, treat fatigue, and even sharpen the mind. Physicians wrote cautiously about its potential. Court gossip whispered more brazenly. One persistent rumor surrounded Charles II, who maintained a private laboratory where he performed chemical experiments, surrounded by astrologers and physicians. According to some reports, he consumed concoctions made from human skulls, possibly even dissolved in wine, believing them to enhance longevity. The goal wasn't cruelty, it was immortality, or at least the royal approximation of it. When your bloodline is the justification for your rule, the maintenance of your body becomes more than health. It becomes doctrine. And for many royals, the preservation of beauty and strength became a moral obligation. Monarchs couldn't appear sick or weak. They had to embody the health of the nation. And if that meant indulging in odd, grotesque rituals behind closed doors, so be it. No, Queen Elizabeth I did not bathe in the blood of virgins, but she did wear lead-based white makeup that slowly poisoned her over time. Her physicians prescribed mercury and arsenic. Her court believed in the healing power of bloodletting, of human bone, and of concoctions with ingredients no modern pharmacy would dare sell. So while the British court never quite matched the Gothic horror of Eastern Europe's blood-soaked legends, it certainly flirted with the aesthetic, with the belief that human essence, especially young essence, could be distilled, preserved, and consumed. And if that sounds like folklore, consider this. In the centuries that followed, royal medicine became increasingly quiet, increasingly private, and increasingly curated for appearances. Which brings us to a 20th century king, one who didn't believe in ritual sacrifice or divine touch, but who was sacrificed in secret by his own doctors to make the headlines more palatable. 26. George V's assisted death, 1936. In the quiet early hours of January 20th, 1936, King George V died at Sandringham House. Official bulletins spoke of a peaceful end, surrounded by family, with dignity intact. Newspapers mourned the monarch's passing with reverence. Tributes poured in from across the empire. It was, by all appearances, a dignified royal death. But it wasn't the truth. Decades later, it was revealed that the king had not merely succumbed to illness. He had been euthanized, intentionally and quietly, by his own royal physician. Not out of malice, but for a different, stranger reason, to meet the newspaper deadline. At the time of his final illness, George V was suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, compounded by years of heavy smoking and a series of bronchial infections. He had long struggled with breathing, fatigue, and coughing fits so intense they left him incapacitated. By January 1936, he was deteriorating quickly. But the decline was slow, inconsistent, and, most importantly, bad for headlines. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, kept a careful diary. It is from this diary that we learn the true story. In an entry written hours before the king's death, Dawson outlined his plan. An injection of morphine and cocaine, administered not to alleviate pain, but to ensure death would occur before midnight. Why? So that the announcement could appear in the Times morning edition, rather than in less dignified evening newspapers. The decision wasn't made by committee. There was no parliamentary debate, no royal decree. It was a quiet, calculated act by a trusted insider who believed he was protecting the crown's image. And in doing so, he revealed something disturbing about the monarchy. Not just how it governs, but how it curates death. George V had been king since 1910, navigating Britain through World War I, the collapse of multiple European empires, and the modernization of the monarchy. He wasn't charismatic like his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, nor intellectual like Kaiser Wilhelm, but he was stable, a quality that became his greatest asset. He modernized the royal image, changed the family name from the Germanic Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, and tried to present the monarchy as domestic, reliable, and above politics. But as with most institutions that survive through illusion, appearances mattered more than reality. And reality, by 1936, was not cooperating. The king was frail, drifting in and out of consciousness, and no longer presentable for public consumption. His voice, once the steady hand of wartime broadcasts, had faded. His body no longer obeyed. He was, in the eyes of his handlers, already gone. What remained was scheduling. The injection worked. The king died peacefully, though that term now rings hollow. Lord Dawson never publicly admitted what he had done. His diary remained private until 1986, when it was published by the Royal College of Physicians, sparking debate, denial, and a flurry of questions that had no satisfying answers. Was it murder, mercy, loyalty, treason? To this day, the royal family has never formally commented on the assisted death. It remains one of those not quite forgotten footnotes in the royal archive, a secret quietly folded into the legend of a monarch who was supposed to embody dignity. But it set a precedent, because from that moment on, the line between royal life and royal performance grew thinner. The crown became not just a symbol of power, but of stagecraft, a carefully timed illusion designed for press deadlines, national mourning, and international optics. And if George V died for the sake of the mourning edition, what happened to his corpse after death was, in its own way, just as bizarre. Because decades later, his son would join him in royal burial, and then become a prop for passing tourists. 27. Charles II's corpse as curiosity. If King Charles II lived flamboyantly, he died inconveniently. And if the public wanted a funeral filled with grandiosity, what they got instead was something else entirely. A body, a box, and eventually, a morbid tourist attraction. Charles II ruled from 1660 to 1685, returning from exile after the collapse of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth and ushering in what came to be known as the Restoration. He brought with him French manners, scientific curiosity, and a sharp disdain for Puritanism. His court became synonymous with wit, debauchery, and extravagance. And when he died unexpectedly at the age of 54, the kingdom mourned a monarch who had, for better or worse, made being royal feel like a party again. But then came the problem of his burial. Charles was interred at Westminster Abbey, the traditional royal resting place. His coffin was placed in the vault beneath the Henry VII Chapel, among the kings and queens of England's past. For centuries it remained sealed, the body undisturbed. But Charles II, it seemed, would not stay anonymous in death. By the 19th century, royal burials had become objects of historical fascination. Antiquarians, curious clergymen, and overzealous amateur historians began opening tombs, cataloging remains, and documenting burial customs. Charles's tomb was opened multiple times during this period, not for any official reason, but out of curiosity. What they found was shocking. His body had partially mummified, preserved by the cool, dry air of the Abbey vault. And more disturbingly, it was recognizably intact. His long black hair still visible, his features still distinguishable. Word spread. Visitors began requesting access. Tour guides whispered stories. In some accounts, guards and workers allowed select guests to view the king's body. Others say his coffin was left open for days during one of the reopenings. giving passers-by a chance to peek inside. There are even rumors, difficult to verify but persistently repeated, that locks of his hair were snipped as souvenirs, and that a few particularly enterprising onlookers managed to touch the remains. In short, King Charles II, the merry monarch, became posthumously objectified, quite literally, as a curiosity. Eventually, the coffin was resealed. Today, the tomb remains closed, marked and catalogued, its contents officially at rest. But the episode lingers, another moment where royal death collided with public appetite. Another instance in which the body of a monarch, once sacrosanct, once feared, became a relic, a rumor, and a sideshow. It raises questions, again, about the line between power and display. When does royalty stop being sacred and start being collectible? When does history become an exhibit? Charles II, in life, cultivated spectacle. In death, he became one. Not by design, but by proximity. His corpse, like so many in royal history, stopped being a person and started being a story. And next, we meet a king whose name is remembered not for his charm, his reign, or his reforms, but for something darker, for hunger, for vengeance, for a legend so grim it still echoes in medieval texts and royal scandal alike. His name was John, and his reputation was starvation. 28. King John's reputation for sadism. If history remembers King John at all, it's usually for signing the Magna Carta, reluctantly and under duress, in 1215. It was a moment that would go on to define constitutional government, trial by jury, and the limits of monarchy. But focusing on that one moment tends to obscure everything else. The betrayals, the taxes, the humiliations, and above all, the deeply cruel streak that earned John the bitter legacy of being England's worst king. Not worst in terms of incompetence, though he had plenty of that, but worst in terms of his unapologetic, small-minded cruelty, a style of rule so corrosive that even medieval chroniclers, no strangers to brutality, were appalled. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and he came to power through a combination of circumstance and opportunism. After the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart in 1199, John inherited a vast empire stretching from northern England to the south of France. But he lacked Richard's charisma, military skill, or public support. And so, instead of ruling through loyalty, John ruled through fear. He taxed the nobility into submission. He demanded hostages from rebellious barons. He undermined the church, defied the pope, and was excommunicated. But his most chilling acts weren't political. They were personal, and often shockingly petty. One of the darkest episodes of his reign involves the starvation of prisoners, including women and children, who had the misfortune of crossing him. The most notorious case is that of Maud de Breauze, a noblewoman whose family had once been loyal to the crown, but fell out of favor after resisting John's increasingly autocratic rule. When her husband rebelled against the king, John didn't just punish him. He targeted Maud and her son. They were captured, imprisoned, and then left to die of hunger in the dungeons of Corfe Castle. No trial, no public execution, just silence and starvation. Even by medieval standards, this was considered excessive. Chroniclers record that their bones were discovered months later, reduced to skeletons on the cold stone floor. It wasn't war. It wasn't politics. It was vengeance, exercised in secret and without consequence. This wasn't an isolated case. John had a habit of taking hostages from noble families, typically children, and using them as insurance against rebellion. When their parents failed to obey, the children disappeared. Records suggest several were starved, neglected, or executed without ceremony. The crown never offered explanations. It didn't need to. The message was clear. Defy John and you pay in blood. Or worse, in silence. His court was a paranoid place. Spies, betrayals, and sudden arrests were the norm. Servants who displeased him could be mutilated. Nobles could find their lands seized on a whim. And his own family fared no better. He imprisoned his nephew Arthur of Brittany, a rival claimant to the throne, and was later suspected of ordering his murder. But what makes John so disturbing is not just his cruelty, it's the pettiness of it. He wasn't tyrannical on a grand imperial scale. He was petty and vindictive, turning his power toward acts of personal retribution, not statecraft. His punishments often seemed designed not to prevent rebellion, but to humiliate. This pathological need to dominate, not just defeat, alienated even his closest supporters. When the barons finally rebelled and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, it wasn't because they had suddenly discovered democracy. It was because they could no longer tolerate the whims of a king who treated their families like bargaining chips. John died in 1216, not in battle but in misery, sick, paranoid, and abandoned by most of his allies. The chroniclers didn't mourn him. One wrote simply, "Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John." Not a glowing review. Today, the monarchy has whitewashed much of its violent history, but John remains difficult to rehabilitate. His legacy isn't grand or tragic. It's just cruel, unrelentingly cruel. A reminder that even divine right has its limits when the crown rests on the head of a vindictive, frightened man. But if John's final years were defined by cold cruelty, his descendants' death centuries later would be defined by an entirely different kind of horror, an accident of decomposition, a grim farce played out beneath the sacred stones of Windsor. 29. Henry VIII's corpse. Exploding, 1547. Few monarchs loom as large over British history as Henry VIII. The man had 6 wives, created his own church, executed friends and enemies alike, and left the country richer in drama than in unity. But for all his iron will and towering ambition, he died not in majesty, but in decay. And what followed was an ending as grotesque as his appetite had been legendary. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry VIII was almost unrecognizable from the virile, athletic king who had first taken the throne in 1509. Years of injuries, illness, and overeating had left him severely obese and barely mobile. He suffered from ulcerated legs, was carried in custom-built chairs, and became increasingly reclusive and paranoid. His final days were plagued by pain and delirium. But Henry, ever the controller of narrative, planned his legacy carefully. His tomb was commissioned. His funeral procession would rival that of the greatest kings. His burial would take place in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, alongside his beloved Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a male heir and died before she could fall out of favor. On the surface, everything proceeded as planned. There were elaborate ceremonies, religious services, and solemn processions. But behind the scenes, things were already going wrong. Due to delays and the sheer scale of the funeral arrangements, Henry's coffin sat too long in transit. The heat and pressure, combined with his physical condition at the time of death, caused a rupture. According to accounts written years later, particularly those of the chronicler Gilbert Burnet, the coffin began to leak. One popular and likely apocryphal story holds that the leaking body fluids dripped onto the floor of the chapel during a stop at Sion Abbey, where a dog was seen licking the pooled liquid. The tale was quickly seized upon by Protestant writers, who interpreted it as divine judgment for Henry's dissolution of the monasteries. Poetic justice, they called it. Is that detail historically reliable? Probably not. But the smell, the decay, and the physical breakdown of the king's body are all consistent with other historical descriptions. And whether or not dogs were involved, the burial did not match the grandeur of his reign. His tomb, too, was unfinished. Despite decades of planning and design, The monumental black marble sarcophagus he had commissioned never fully materialized. The grand tomb designed by Torrigiano, complete with bronze effigies and angels, was abandoned in the chaos following his death. The bronze, in fact, was later repurposed by Oliver Cromwell for military uses, including cannons. So the king who had reshaped the Church of England and defied the Pope was buried in a modest vault next to Jane Seymour under a simple slab. No grand effigy, no golden crown, just stone, sealed and silent. There's a strange symmetry to it. Henry VIII had made spectacle his style, marrying publicly, divorcing brutally, dissolving monasteries with theatrical flair. His life was lived in defiance of tradition, and yet, in death, he became the subject of folklore, poetic vengeance, and the kind of grotesque humor that history loves. The bloated king, leaking in the chapel, the dog, the dripping casket, it all feels too on the nose to be real. But that's the thing about Henry VIII. His legacy is inseparable from the myth. He wrote his own drama in life, and history gave him one more act in death. And the irony? The church he created, the throne he guarded so viciously, would go on without him. Cleaned up, rebranded, and just as ruthless in its own way. And next comes a figure who took that ruthlessness abroad. A prince, a warlord, and the darling of English chivalry, until his campaigns in France turned into something far darker. Because burning villages isn't noble. But for the Black Prince, it was strategy. 30. The Black Prince's Atrocities, 14th Century. In the Grand Gallery of English medieval legends, Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, often appears as a gleaming figure of chivalric glory. He was handsome, noble, undefeated in battle, and the presumed future king of England. His black armor, his battlefield command, his victories at Crécy and Poitiers, all of it made him the poster child for a mythologized past. But as with most legends, the truth underneath is darker. Much darker. The Black Prince wasn't a king, but he came very close. The eldest son of Edward III, he was groomed to inherit not just the English crown, but the military legacy of an empire in the making. And to that end, he was unleashed on France during the 100 Years' War, a war that, for all its noble banners and knightly ceremonies, was essentially about land, pride, and money. The prince earned his reputation young. At just 16, he led troops at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, a stunning English victory over a larger French force. Chroniclers hailed his courage. His father praised his valor. But what they didn't mention, at least not loudly, was what came after the battles. The pillaging, the systematic destruction of entire towns, the deliberate use of terror as military strategy. One of the most notorious examples came in 1355, during the so-called Great Chevauchée. This wasn't a battle. It was a scorched earth campaign. The Black Prince and his army rode through southern France, burning towns, razing villages, and destroying crops. Not as collateral damage, but as policy. The goal was simple: break the economy, starve the population, and humiliate the French crown. This wasn't warfare in the knightly sense, it was strategic cruelty aimed at crippling infrastructure and morale. Estimates vary, but the Chevauchée of 1355 left thousands homeless, destitute, and desperate. Entire communities vanished. This wasn't done in the heat of battle or as punishment for rebellion. It was done because scorched earth was cheaper than occupation. The Black Prince wasn't just a war hero, he was a calculator of misery. And he didn't stop there. In 1356, he struck again, this time capturing the French king, John II, at the Battle of Poitiers. Instead of ending the war, the capture escalated it. Ransoms were demanded. More raids followed. In 1370, the prince ordered the sack of Limoges, a French city that had defected to the other side. English troops stormed the city. Buildings were torched. Hundreds were killed, many of them civilians. Later, English chroniclers tried to paint the event as exaggerated. Others insisted it was necessary. But there's little doubt that Edward of Woodstock, for all his courtly polish and tournament victories, wielded brutality as a weapon of policy. Even his final years suggest a grim pattern. The Black Prince never became king. He died in 1376, a year before his father, of a lingering illness, possibly dysentery or another chronic disease. His body deteriorated slowly. His once legendary strength failed him. And in the end, he was buried with great fanfare, even as the war he had helped escalate dragged on for another half-century. So why is he remembered so fondly? Because history likes a winner, and the Black Prince won, on the battlefield, in the dynastic charts, and in the romantic imaginations of later historians. He looked the part. He played the role. He was the shining heir of chivalry. But behind the armor and the myth was a man who ordered the burning of villages, not because he hated them, but because it was efficient. That's the unsettling part. He didn't rage. He calculated. And if Edward of Woodstock's cruelty was justified by military goals, the next royal figure's final chapter veers into something even stranger. A body preserved, dissected, and reduced to dust. A royal heart, once honored, that ultimately crumbled into nothing. 31. Richard I's heart, preserved in poison. There is something uniquely poetic and disturbing about the posthumous fate of Richard the Lionheart, a king who spent barely 6 months of his reign in England, a crusader who fought not for his people, but for a holy war that bled half of Europe dry, a warrior, a romantic icon, a propaganda tool, and in the end, a medical oddity whose heart was embalmed in a cocktail of substances that reads more like alchemy than honor. Richard I died in 1199, not on the battlefield, but during a relatively minor siege in central France. While inspecting the walls of Châlus-Chabrol, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, and he died days later. It was a surprisingly quiet end for a king whose life had been anything but. But his burial, or burials, plural, were anything but simple. Like many medieval monarchs, Richard was divided. His body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou alongside his father, Henry II. His entrails were buried at Châlus, and his heart, the symbolic seat of his courage, was removed, embalmed, and entombed in ruined cathedral in Normandy. For centuries, the heart remained untouched. Then, in 1838, it was unearthed during renovations. The find made headlines across Europe. The remains were analyzed, catalogued, and stored in a lead box. But it wasn't until 2013, yes, 8 centuries after Richard's death, that a full scientific analysis was conducted. What they found was more legend than legacy. The heart had completely disintegrated, reduced to fine black powder. But within that dust, researchers discovered traces of mercury, frankincense, mint, daisy, and myrtle, a bizarre blend of religious, aromatic, and preservative materials. It was less embalming and more ritual magic. Frankincense was a gift to the baby Jesus. Mercury was believed to preserve flesh. Daisy symbolized innocence. Myrtle, love. What does it say that Richard's heart was preserved like a relic of a saint, rather than the vital organ of a warrior king? It says everything about the contradiction at the heart of his reign. Richard was brutal. He massacred prisoners during the Crusades. He drained the treasury. He was virtually absent from England. But he was also worshipped. His legend was so powerful that even his decaying heart had to be infused with symbolism and spice, wrapped in myth, and buried as though it could bless the earth around it. And yet, it turned to dust. All of it. The relic. The story. The essence. Not preserved, not sacred, just particles in a box. The discovery in 2013 confirmed what many historians already suspected. that kingship in the medieval world was as much about ritual performance as it was about governance. Richard's heart wasn't preserved because he was a good man. It was preserved because he was a story. And like all stories, it had to be embalmed in meaning. In the end, there was no magic, no sanctity, just a pile of finely crushed remains and a list of medieval preservatives that reads like a failed recipe for immortality. And next, we descend further, from relics to refuse, from holy dust to royal neglect. Because the next queen on our list didn't just die forgotten. She was buried like a mistake, tossed into a box meant for arrows, and left in the shadow of the tower that ended her life. 32. Anne Boleyn's heartless burial. The story of Anne Boleyn is one of the most iconic tragedies in British royal history. A woman who rose from minor nobility to the Queen of England, only to fall spectacularly at the hands of the very husband who once rewrote the laws of God to have her. Her life has been dramatized, romanticized, and mythologized into a Shakespearean cycle of ambition, betrayal, and paranoia. But what often gets left out, what doesn't make the cut in period dramas or classroom history, is what happened to her body after the axe fell. Because the final indignity wasn't her death. It was her burial. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed within the walls of the Tower of London by a specially imported French executioner known for his swift sword technique. The charge was treason, specifically adultery and incest. The trial was a farce. The verdict was predetermined. The queen who had helped split England from Rome was no longer useful, and Henry VIII was ready to move on, preferably by the weekend. But if Anne's death was cold and calculated, her burial was something worse, an afterthought. Traditionally, queens were buried with ceremony, with ornate coffins, grand tombs, and heraldic symbolism. But Anne, despite still being legally queen until the moment of her death, was not afforded the honors of her position. Her body was hastily wrapped in cloth, no royal vestments, no embalming, and placed not in a ceremonial casket, but in what sources describe as a used arrow chest. Yes, a chest designed to hold military equipment, because no one had planned for her burial, or perhaps no one wanted to. She was interred beneath the floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, the chapel within the tower itself. There was no headstone, no plaque, no visible marker. For centuries, no one even knew the exact location of her remains. The woman who had been Queen of England, mother of the future Elizabeth I, and catalyst for the English Reformation, was effectively buried in anonymity. It wasn't until 1876, more than 3 centuries later, that her likely resting place was identified during renovations to the chapel. Workers discovered a number of skeletons buried beneath the floor, including the remains of a female of approximately Anne's age and stature. Based on circumstantial evidence and position within the chapel, it was concluded to be her. A marble plaque was later installed to mark the spot. But the plaque and the identification came centuries too late. By then, the woman had become a symbol, a myth, a ghost. The actual flesh and bone individual who had navigated the Tudor court, given birth to a future monarch, and died under a sword's arc had been reduced to a missing person in her own history. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, never spoke publicly about her mother's death. She never sought to exhume the remains, to rebury her with the honors denied her, or to construct a memorial worthy of her station. Perhaps it was political caution. Perhaps emotional distance. Perhaps a calculated silence from a daughter who ruled with an understanding of how treacherous memory could be. But the silence is deafening. Anne Boleyn was remembered but not rested, revered but not respected. She became the cautionary tale, the schemer who flew too close to the crown. But beneath the symbolism, there's something much colder. A woman placed in a box meant for arrows. A queen discarded like equipment. It's not just unjust. It's deliberately cruel. And next, we turn to another royal whose legacy is tangled in shadow. Because while Anne Boleyn was tried, executed, and erased in broad daylight, the next figure on our list was never proven guilty, never brought to trial, and never officially accused. But for over a century, he's been whispered about in the alleys of history, not as a queen killer, but as something far worse. 33. Prince Albert Victor's Ripper. Rumors of all the scandals to swirl around the British royal family, none are as persistent, as unsettling, or as utterly unprovable as the rumors surrounding Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. The grandson of Queen Victoria, second in line to the throne, and royal golden boy of his day, Albert Victor was meant to represent continuity and calm in the imperial age. Instead, he became a legend of absence, ambiguity, and most controversially, association with the Whitechapel murders. Yes, those murders, the ones committed by Jack the Ripper. Let's be very clear, there is no hard evidence linking Prince Albert Victor to the Ripper killings. No forensic trail, no official inquiry, no credible testimony. But there is a vortex of strange coincidences, odd behaviors, and elite silence that have kept his name in the footnotes of true crime lore ever since. Born in 1864 to Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark, Albert Victor was a puzzling figure even in life. He was, by many accounts, handsome but dim, polite but vacant. Tutors struggled to teach him. Courtiers found him charming but disturbingly detached. Some biographers have speculated about developmental delays or neurological disorders. Others claim he was simply bored. What is documented is that Albert Victor was entangled in at least one major scandal, the Cleveland Street Affair of 1889, a male brothel scandal that reached deep into the aristocracy. His name was reportedly connected, though never publicly acknowledged by the crown. The government covered the matter quickly and discreetly, sealing documents and steering the prince far from scrutiny. That scandal alone would have been enough to cast a long shadow. But then, around the same time, came the Ripper murders, a series of horrific killings in the Whitechapel district of London between 1888 and 1891. The killer was never caught. The case, saturated in gore and mystery, gripped the public imagination. And into that vacuum of unknowing, Prince Albert Victor's name began to echo. Why? Partly because of timing. He was living in London during the early murders. Partly because of status. What better narrative than a nobleman who stalks the poor in the dead of night? And partly because of the vacuum of information. Rumors abhor a vacuum, especially royal ones. Over time, multiple conspiracy theories emerged. That Albert Victor had contracted a disease and gone mad, killing in a psychotic frenzy, that he had fathered a child with a working-class woman, and the murders were a cover-up, that he had a dissociative identity and lived a double life as a sadistic killer. All of them lack evidence. All of them are theatrical, improbable, and tinged with class anxiety. But the fact that these stories persist says more about the institution than the man. Because Albert Victor, like so many royals, was raised in a hall of mirrors. He was protected, insulated, and vaguely defined. So when the public searched for answers to a truly monstrous crime, they looked not to the gutters, but to the palaces. They suspected the unspeakable because the monarchy seemed to make everything else unthinkable. Albert Victor died young in 1892 of pneumonia, aged just 28. His death was mourned by the royal family, mourned by the public, and used to cement the popularity of his younger brother, George V, who would eventually become king. The Ripper murders were never solved. The case remains the most infamous cold case in British criminal history. And Prince Albert Victor? He remains entangled in the myth. Not because he was guilty, but because he could have been, and because no one would tell us either way. His story is less about crime than it is about silence, about how power, Secrecy and reputation warp the truth until even the innocent seems suspicious. And so, our long descent through royal darkness ends not with a bang, but with a whisper. A name never proven, a crime never solved, and a crown forever haunted by the weight of its own shadows.